Welcome, dear listener. You've entered Audible Archives, a sanctuary of sound where lost tales awaken, your guide through these ancient echoes and timeless legends. So lean back, breathe deep, and let the story begin. This is Audible Archives, where every word holds a whisper of magic.
This is Audible Archives, and I'm Rob, your host today for the true and unforgettable. In these next chapters of 12 Years a Slave, the chains don't just weigh on the body, they press into the soul. Solomon is sold again, this time into the hands of Edwin Epps, a name that echoes cruelty. Day after day, year after year, the field becomes his prison, but inside him there is still fire, still memory, still the unbroken will to be free. These are chapters 11 to 16 of 12 Years a Slave. Listen closely.
Chapter 11. After a long sleep, sometime in the afternoon I awoke refreshed, but very sore and stiff. Sally came in and talked with me, while John cooked me some dinner. Sally was in great trouble, as well as myself, one of her children being ill, and she feared it could not survive. Dinner over, after walking about the quarters for a while, visiting Sally's cabin and looking at the sick child, I strolled into the madam's garden. Though it was a season of the year when the voices of the birds are silent, and the trees are stripped of their summer glories in more frigid climes, yet the whole variety of roses were then blooming there, and the long, luxuriant vines creeping over the frames. The crimson and golden fruit hung half hidden amidst the younger and older blossoms of the peach, the orange, the plum, and the pomegranate. For in that region of almost perpetual warmth, the leaves are falling and the buds bursting into bloom the whole year long. I indulged the most grateful feelings towards Master and Mistress Ford, and wishing in some manner to repay their kindness, commenced trimming the vines, and afterwards weeding out the grass from among the orange and pomegranate trees. The latter grows 8 or 10 feet high, and its fruit, though larger, is similar in appearance to the jelly flower. It has the luscious flavor of the strawberry. Oranges, peaches, plums, and most other fruits are indigenous to the rich, warm soil of Avoyelles. But the apple, the most common of them all in colder latitudes, is rarely to be seen. Mistress Ford came out presently, saying it was praiseworthy in me, but I was not in a condition to labor, and might rest myself at the quarters until Master should go down to Bayou Boeuf, which would not be that day, and it might not be the next. I said to her to be sure I felt bad and was stiff, and that my foot pained me, the stubs and thorns having so torn it, but thought such exercise would not hurt me, and that it was a great pleasure to work for so good a mistress. Thereupon she returned to the great house, and for 3 days I was diligent in the garden, cleaning the walks, weeding the flower beds, and pulling up the rank grass beneath the jessamine vines, which the gentle and generous hand of my protectress had taught to clamber along the walls. The 4th morning, having become recruited and refreshed, Master Ford ordered me to make ready to accompany him to the bayou. There was but one saddle horse at the opening, all the others, with the mules, having been sent down to the plantation. I said I could walk, and bidding Sally and John goodbye, left the opening, trotting along by the horse's side. That little paradise in the great pine woods was the oasis in the desert, towards which my heart turned lovingly during many years of bondage. I went forth from it now with regret and sorrow, not so overwhelming, however, as if it had then been given me to know that I should never return to it again. Master Ford urged me to take his place occasionally on the horse to rest me, but I said no, I was not tired, and it was better for me to walk than him. He said many kind and cheering things to me on the way, riding slowly, in order that I might keep pace with him. The goodness of God was manifest, he declared, in my miraculous escape from the swamp. As Daniel came forth unharmed from the den of lions, and as Jonah had been preserved in the whale's belly, even so had I been delivered from evil by the Almighty. He interrogated me in regard to the various fears and emotions I had experienced during the day and night, and if I had felt, at any time, a desire to pray. I felt forsaken of the whole world, I answered him, and was praying mentally all the while. At such times, said he, the heart of man turns instinctively towards his Maker. In prosperity, and when there is nothing to injure or make him afraid, he remembers him not, and is ready to defy him. But place him in the midst of dangers, cut him off from human aid. Let the grave open before him, then it is, in the time of his tribulation, that the scoffer and unbelieving man turns to God for help, feeling there is no other hope or refuge or safety, save in his protecting arm. So did that benignant man speak to me of this life and of the life hereafter, of the goodness and power of God, and of the vanity of earthly things, as we journeyed along the solitary road towards Bayou Boeuf. When within some 5 miles of the plantation, we discovered a horseman at a distance, galloping towards us. As he came near, I saw that it was Tibiats. He looked at me a moment, but did not address me, and turning about, rode along side by side with Ford. I trotted silently at their horses' heels, listening to their conversation. Ford informed him of my arrival in the pine woods 3 days before, of the sad plight I was in, and of the difficulties and dangers I had encountered. "Well," exclaimed Tibiats, omitting his usual oaths in the presence of Ford, "I never saw such running before. I'll bet him against $100. He'll beat any nigger in Louisiana." I offered John David Cheney $25 to catch him, dead or alive, but he outran his dogs in a fair race. Them Cheney dogs ain't much, after all. Dunwoody's hounds would have had him down before he touched the palmettos. Somehow the dogs got off the track, and we had to give up the hunt. We rode the horses as far as we could, and then kept on foot till the water was 3 feet deep. The boys said he was drowned, sure. I allow I want a shot at him mightily. Ever since, I have been riding up and down the bayou, but hadn't too much hope of catching him, thought he was dead. Sartain. Oh, he's a cuss to run, that nigger is. In this way Tibiats ran on, describing his search in the swamp, the wonderful speed with which I had fled before the hounds. And when he had finished, Master Ford responded by saying, I had always been a willing and faithful boy with him, that he was sorry we had such trouble, that according to Platt's story he had been inhumanly treated, and that he, Tibiats, was himself in fault. Using hatchets and broadaxes upon slaves was shameful, and should not be allowed, he remarked. This is no way of dealing with them. When first brought into the country, it will have a pernicious influence and set them all running away. The swamps will be full of them. A little kindness would be far more effectual in restraining them and rendering them obedient than the use of such deadly weapons. Every planter on the bayou should frown upon such inhumanity. It is for the interest of all to do so. It is evident enough, Mr. Tibiats, that you and Platt cannot live together. You dislike him and would not hesitate to kill him, and knowing it, he will run from you again through fear of his life. Now, Tibiats, you must sell him or hire him out at least. Unless you do so, I shall take measures to get him out of your possession. In this spirit Ford addressed him the remainder of the distance. I opened not my mouth. On reaching the plantation, they entered the great house, while I repaired to Eliza's cabin. The slaves were astonished to find me there, on returning from the field, supposing I was drowned. That night, again, they gathered about the cabin to listen to the story of my adventure. They took it for granted I would be whipped, and that it would be severe, the well-known penalty of running away being 500 lashes. Poor fellow, said Eliza, taking me by the hand. It would have been better for you if you had drowned. You have a cruel master, and he will kill you yet, I am afraid. Lawson suggested that it might be Overseer Chapin would be appointed to inflict the punishment, in which case it would not be severe, whereupon Mary, Rachel Bristol, and others hoped it would be Master Ford, and then it would be no whipping at all. They all pitied me and tried to console me, and were sad in view of the castigation that awaited me, except Kentucky John. There were no bounds to his laughter. He filled the cabin with cachinnations, holding his sides to prevent an explosion, and the cause of his noisy mirth was the idea of my outstripping the hounds. Somehow, He looked at the subject in a comical light. I know day, wouldn't he catch him, when he run across the plantation. Oh, Delore, didn't he plat pig his feet right up, though? Hey? When dem dogs got where he was in T-dark. Oh, Delore mighty. And then Kentucky John relapsed into another of his boisterous fits. Early the next morning, Tibiats left the plantation. In the course of the forenoon, while sauntering about the gin house, a tall, good-looking man came to me and inquired if I was Tibiat's boy, that youthful appellation being applied indiscriminately to slaves, even though they may have passed the number of 80 years and 10. I took off my hat and answered that I was. How would you like to work for me? He inquired. Oh, I would like to very much, said I, inspired with a sudden hope of getting away from Tibiats. You worked under Myers at Peter Tanner, didn't you? I replied I had, adding some complimentary remarks that Myers had made concerning me. Well, boy, said he, I have hired you of your master to work for me in the big cane brake, 38 miles from here, down on Red River. This man was Mr. Eldred, who lived below Ford's, on the same side of the bayou. I accompanied him to his plantation, and in the morning started with his slave Sam, and a wagon load of provisions, drawn by 4 mules, for the big cane, Eldred, and Myers, having preceded us on horseback. This Sam was a native of Charleston, where he had a mother, brother, and sisters. He allowed a common word among both black and white that Tibiats was a mean man, and hoped, as I most earnestly did also, that his master would buy me. We proceeded down the south shore of the bayou, crossing it at Carey's plantation, from thence to Huff Power, passing which we came upon the Bayou Rouge Road, which runs towards Red River. After passing through Bayou Rouge Swamp, and just at sunset, turning from the highway, we struck off into the big cane brake. We followed an unbeaten track, scarcely wide enough to admit the wagon. The canes, such as are used for fishing rods, were as thick as they could stand. A person could not be seen through them the distance of a rod. The paths of wild beasts run through them in various directions, the bear and the American tiger abounding in these brakes. And wherever there is a basin of stagnant water, it is full of alligators. We kept on our lonely course through the big cane several miles, when we entered a clearing known as Sutton's Field. Many years before, a man by the name of Sutton had penetrated the wilderness of cane to this solitary place. Tradition has it that he fled thither a fugitive, not from service, but from justice. Here he lived a lone recluse and hermit of the swamp, with his own hands planting the seed and gathering in the harvest. One day a band of Indians stole upon his solitude, and after a bloody battle, overpowered and massacred him. For miles the country round, in the slaves' quarters and on the piazzas of great houses, where white children listen to superstitious tales, the story goes that that spot in the heart of the big cane is a haunted place. For more than a quarter of a century, human voices had rarely, if ever, disturbed the silence of the clearing. Rank and noxious weeds had overspread the once cultivated field. Serpents sunned themselves on the doorway of the crumbling cabin. It was indeed a dreary picture of desolation. Passing Sutton's Field, we followed a new-cut road 2 miles farther, which brought us to its termination. We had now reached the wild lands of Mr. Eldred, where he contemplated clearing up an extensive plantation. We went to work next morning with our cane knives and cleared a sufficient space to allow the erection of 2 cabins, one for Myers and Eldred, the other for Sam, myself, and the slaves that were to join us. We were now in the midst of trees of enormous growth, whose wide-spreading branches almost shut out the light of the sun, while the space between the trunks was an impervious mass of cane, with here and there an occasional palmetto. The bay and the sycamore, the oak and the cypress, reach a growth unparalleled in those fertile lowlands bordering the Red River. From every tree, moreover, hang long, large masses of moss, presenting to the eye unaccustomed to them a striking and singular appearance. This moss, in large quantities, is sent north, and there used for manufacturing purposes. We cut down oaks, split them into rails, and with these erected temporary cabins. We covered the roofs with a broad palmetto leaf, an excellent substitute for shingles, as long as they last. The greatest annoyance I met with here were small flies, gnats, and mosquitoes. They swarmed the air. They penetrated the porches of the ear, the nose, the eyes, the mouth. They sucked themselves beneath the skin. It was impossible to brush or beat them off. It seemed, indeed, as if they would devour us, carry us away piecemeal, in their small tormenting mouths. A lonelier spot or one more disagreeable than the center of the big canebrake, it would be difficult to conceive. Yet to me it was a paradise, in comparison with any other place in the company of Master Tibiats. I labored hard and oft times was weary and fatigued, yet I could lie down at night in peace, and arise in the morning without fear. In the course of a fortnight, 4 black girls came down from Eldred's plantation, Charlotte, Fanny, Cresia, and Nellie. They were all large and stout. Axes were put into their hands, and they were sent out with Sam and myself to cut trees. They were excellent choppers, the largest oak or sycamore standing, but a brief season before their heavy and well-directed blows. At piling logs, they were equal to any man. There are lumberwomen as well as lumbermen in the forests of the South. In fact, in the region of the Bayou Boeuf, they perform their share of all the labor required on the plantation. They plow, drag, drive team, clear wildlands, work on the highway, and so forth. Some planters, owning large cotton and sugar plantations, have none other than the labor of slave women. Such a one is Jim Burns, who lives on the north shore of the bayou, opposite the plantation of John Fuggerman. On our arrival in the break, Eldred promised me if I worked well, I might go up to visit my friends at Ford's in 4 weeks. On Saturday night of the 5th week, I reminded him of his promise, when he told me I had done so well that I might go. I had set my heart upon it, and Eldred's announcement thrilled me with pleasure. I was to return in time to commence the labors of the day on Tuesday morning, while indulging the pleasant anticipation of so soon meeting my old friends again. Suddenly, the hateful form of Tibiats appeared among us. He inquired how Myers and Platt got along together, and was told very well, and that Platt was going up to Ford's plantation in the morning on a visit. "Ho, po," sneered Tibiats. "It isn't worth while the nigger will get unsteady. He can't go." But Eldred insisted I had worked faithfully, that he had given me his promise, and that, under the circumstances, I ought not to be disappointed. They then, it being about dark, entered one cabin and I the other. I could not give up the idea of going. It was a sore disappointment. Before morning I resolved, if Eldred made no objection, to leave at all hazards. At daylight I was at his door with my blanket rolled up into a bundle and hanging on a stick over my shoulder, waiting for a pass. Tibiats came out presently in one of his disagreeable moods, washed his face, and going to a stump nearby, sat down upon it, apparently busily thinking with himself. After standing there a long time, impelled by a sudden impulse of impatience, I started off. "Are you going without a pass?" he cried out to me. "Yes, master thought I would," I answered. "How do you think you'll get there?" demanded he. "Don't know," was all the reply I made him. "You'd be taken and sent to jail where you ought to be before you got halfway there," he added, passing into the cabin as he said it. He came out soon with the pass in his hand, and calling me a d-d nigger that deserved 100 lashes, threw it on the ground. I picked it up and hurried away right speedily. A slave caught off his master's plantation without a pass may be seized and whipped by any white man whom he meets. The one I now received was dated and read as follows: Platt has permission to go to Ford's plantation on Bayou Boeuf and return by Tuesday morning. John M. Tibiats. This is the usual form. On the way, a great many demanded it, read it, and passed on. Those having the air and appearance of gentlemen, whose dress indicated the possession of wealth, frequently took no notice of me whatever. But a shabby fellow, an unmistakable loafer, never failed to hail me, and to scrutinize and examine me in the most thorough manner. Catching runaways is sometimes a money-making business. If, after advertising, no owner appears, they may be sold to the highest bidder, and certain fees are allowed the finder for his services at all events, even if reclaimed. A mean white, therefore, a name applied to the species loafer, considers it a godsend to meet an unknown Negro without a pass. There are no inns along the highways in that portion of the state where I sojourned. I was wholly destitute of money, neither did I carry any provisions. On my journey from the Big Cane to Bayou Boeuf, nevertheless, with his pass in his hand, a slave need never suffer from hunger or from thirst. It is only necessary to present it to the master or overseer of a plantation, and state his wants, when he will be sent round to the kitchen and provided with food or shelter, as the case may require. The traveler stops at any house and calls for a meal with as much freedom as if it was a public tavern. It is the general custom of the country, whatever their faults may be. It is certain the inhabitants along Red River and around the bayous in the interior of Louisiana are not wanting in hospitality. I arrived at Ford's plantation toward the close of the afternoon, passing the evening in Eliza's cabin, with Lawson, Rachel, and others of my acquaintance. When we left Washington, Eliza's form was round and plump. She stood erect, and in her silks and jewels, presented a picture of graceful strength and elegance. Now she was but a thin shadow of her former self. Her face had become ghastly haggard, and the once straight and active form was bowed down, as if bearing the weight of 100 years. Crouching on her cabin floor and clad in the coarse garments of a slave, old Alicia Berry would not have recognized the mother of his child. I never saw her afterwards. Having become useless in the cotton field, she was bartered for a trifle to some man residing in the vicinity of Peter Compton's. Grief had gnawed remorselessly at her heart until her strength was gone, and for that her last master, it is said, lashed and abused her most unmercifully. But he could not whip back the departed vigor of her youth, nor straighten up that bended body to its full height, such as it was when her children were around her, and the light of freedom was shining on her path. I learned the particulars relative to her departure from this world from some of Compton's slaves, who had come over Red River to the bayou, to assist young Madam Tanner during the busy season. She became at length, they said, utterly helpless. For several weeks lying on the ground floor in a dilapidated cabin, dependent upon the mercy of her fellow thralls for an occasional drop of water and a morsel of food. Her master did not knock her on the head, as is sometimes done to put a suffering animal out of misery, but left her unprovided for and unprotected, to linger through a life of pain and wretchedness to its natural close. When the hands returned from the field one night, they found her dead. During the day the angel of the Lord, who moveth invisibly over all the earth, gathering in his harvest of departing souls, had silently entered the cabin of the dying woman and taken her from thence. She was free at last. Next day, rolling up my blanket, I started on my return to the Big Cane. After traveling 5 miles at a place called Huff Power, the ever-present Tibiats met me in the road. He inquired why I was going back so soon, and when informed I was anxious to return by the time I was directed, he said I need go no farther than the next plantation, as he had that day sold me to Edwin Epps. We walked down into the yard where we met the latter gentleman, who examined me and asked me the usual questions propounded by purchasers. Having been duly delivered over, I was ordered to the quarters, and at the same time directed to make a hoe and axe handle for myself. I was now no longer the property of Tibiats's dog, his brute, dreading his wrath and cruelty day and night, and whoever or whatever my new master might prove to be, I could not certainly regret the change. So it was good news when the sale was announced, and with a sigh of relief I sat down for the first time in my new abode. Tibiats soon after disappeared from that section of the country. Once afterwards, and only once, I caught a glimpse of him. It was many miles from Bayou Boeuf. He was seated in the doorway of a low groggery. I was passing in a drove of slaves through St. Mary's Parish. In Chapter 11, the curtain drops on Ford's fragile kindness. Solomon Northup, still laboring under the name Platt, is no longer simply a man owned. He is now a man traded, a debt, an inconvenience, a line moved from one ledger to another. And so Ford, the preacher, the so-called good master, sells Solomon not in cruelty, but in cold necessity. The chapter begins quietly. No whip, no chase, no blood, just a sale. Ford sells Solomon to Edward Epps, a name that will come to define the next and darkest stretch of Solomon's captivity. And in that moment, the final remnants of dignity, of trust, of hope in Ford's mercy evaporate, because Solomon sees the truth. A man who claims to be good, but still owns another, is only good until it costs him something. This chapter cuts deep not with action, but with implication. Ford knows Solomon is innocent. He knows he was kidnapped. He even treats him with a measure of respect. But he still sells him to a man with a reputation for violence and cruelty. Why? Because Solomon isn't a man to him. Not truly. He's property. And when property becomes a burden, you sell it. That betrayal is quieter than the lash, but in many ways more devastating. Ford stands as a symbolic contradiction. A religious man, a man of sermons, scripture, salvation. And yet he becomes a vehicle of despair. He sends Solomon into the hands of a man he would never trust with his own kin. This hypocrisy isn't just personal, it's systemic. Slavery corrupted even the moral core of those who claim virtue. In this system, even the righteous are bound by economy, and their goodness always has limits. In the 1800s, enslaved people were used as collateral, assets used to settle debts, just like land or cattle. Solomon isn't sold because he failed. He's sold because Ford owes money, and a smart, strong slave fetches a higher price. No cruelty, no anger, just numbers. A life traded like merchandise in a country built on liberty. For a time, Solomon had learned to endure. He knew Ford's patterns. He kept his head down. But now he faces the unknown again. New master, new land, new dangers. And this time, he enters the grip of Edward Epps, a man who takes pride in pain, who rules not with reason, but rage. Solomon's resilience will be tested in ways even the rope could not prepare him for. In chapter 11, Solomon learns that kindness in chains is not liberation. It is only a slower descent. Ford's farewell is not cruel, but it is final. And as Solomon rides away, chained once more, his fate tossed to the winds, he understands slavery does not end with survival. It ends with freedom, or it does not end at all. And Edward Epps will not be kind. Chapter 12. Edwin Epps, of whom much will be said during the remainder of this history, is a large, portly, heavy-bodied man with light hair, high cheekbones, and a Roman nose of extraordinary dimensions. He has blue eyes of fair complexion and is, as I should say, full 6 feet high. He has the sharp, inquisitive expression of a jockey. His manners are repulsive and coarse, and his language gives speedy and unequivocal evidence that he has never enjoyed the advantages of an education. He has the faculty of saying most provoking things, in that respect even excelling old Peter Tanner. At the time I came into his possession, Edwin Epps was fond of the bottle, his sprees sometimes extending over the space of 2 whole weeks. Latterly, however, he had reformed his habits, and when I left him, was as strict a specimen of temperance as could be found on Bayou Boeuf. When in his cups, Master Epps was a roistering, blustering, noisy fellow, whose chief delight was in dancing with his niggers, or lashing them about the yard with his long whip, just for the pleasure of hearing them screech and scream, as the great welts were planted on their backs. When sober, he was silent, reserved and cunning, not beating us indiscriminately, as in his drunken moments, but sending the end of his rawhide to some tender spot of a lagging slave, with a sly dexterity peculiar to himself. He had been a driver and overseer in his younger years, but at this time was in possession of a plantation on Bayou Huffpower, 2.5 miles from Holmesville, 18 from Marksville, and 12 from Cheneyville. It belonged to Joseph B. Roberts, his wife's uncle, and was leased by Epps. His principal business was raising cotton, and inasmuch as some may read this book who have never seen a cotton field, a description of the manner of its culture may not be out of place. The ground is prepared by throwing up beds or ridges with the plow, back furrowing, it is called. Oxen and mules, the latter almost exclusively, are used in plowing. The women as frequently as the men perform this labor, feeding, currying, and taking care of their teams, and in all respects doing the field and stable work, precisely as do the plowboys of the North. The beds or ridges are 6 feet wide, that is, from water furrow to water furrow. A plow drawn by one mule is then run along the top of the ridge or center of the bed, making the drill, into which a girl usually drops the seed, which she carries in a bag hung round her neck. Behind her comes a mule and harrow covering up the seed, so that 2 mules, 3 slaves, a plow and harrow are employed in planting a row of cotton. This is done in the months of March and April. Corn is planted in February. When there are no cold rains, the cotton usually makes its appearance in a week. In the course of 8 or 10 days afterwards, the first hoeing is commenced. This is performed in part also by the aid of the plow and mule. The plow passes as near as possible to the cotton on both sides, throwing the furrow from it. Slaves follow with their hoes, cutting up the grass and cotton, leaving hills 2 feet and a half apart. This is called scraping cotton. In 2 weeks, more commences the second hoeing. This time the furrow is thrown towards the cotton. Only one stalk, the largest, is now left standing in each hill. In another fortnight it is hoed the 3rd time, throwing the furrow towards the cotton in the same manner as before, and killing all the grass between the rows. About the 1st of July, when it is a foot high or thereabouts, it is hoed the 4th and last time. Now the whole space between the rows is plowed, leaving a deep water furrow in the center. During all these hoeings, the overseer or driver follows the slaves on horseback with a whip, such as has been described. The fastest hoer takes the lead row. He is usually about a rod in advance of his companions. If one of them passes him, he is whipped. If one falls behind or is a moment idle, he is whipped. In fact, the lash is flying from morning until night, the whole day long. The hoeing season thus continues from April until July, a field having no sooner been finished once than it is commenced again. In the latter part of August begins the cotton picking season. At this time each slave is presented with a sack. A strap is fastened to it which goes over the neck, holding the mouth of the sack breast high, while the bottom reaches nearly to the ground. Each one is also presented with a large basket that will hold about 2 barrels. This is to put the cotton in when the sack is filled. The baskets are carried to the field and placed at the beginning of the rows. When a new hand, one unaccustomed to the business, is sent for the first time into the field, he is whipped up smartly and made for that day to pick as fast as he can possibly. At night it is weighed, so that his capability in cotton picking is known. He must bring in the same weight each night following. If it falls short, it is considered evidence that he has been laggard, and a greater or less number of lashes is the penalty. An ordinary day's work is 200 pounds. A slave who is accustomed to picking is punished if he or she brings in a less quantity than that. There is a great difference among them as regards this kind of labor. Some of them seem to have a natural knack or quickness which enables them to pick with great celerity and with both hands, while others, with whatever practice or industry, are utterly unable to come up to the ordinary standard. Such hands are taken from the cotton field and employed in other business. Patsy, of whom I shall have more to say, was known as the most remarkable cotton picker on Bayou Burf. She picked with both hands, and with such surprising rapidity that 500 pounds a day was not unusual for her. Each one is tasked, therefore, according to his picking abilities, none, however, to come short of 200 weight. I, being unskillful always in that business, would have satisfied my master by bringing in the latter quantity, while on the other hand, Patsy would surely have been beaten if she failed to produce twice as much. The cotton grows from 5 to 7 feet high, each stalk having a great many branches, shooting out in all directions, and lapping each other above the water furrow. There are few sights more pleasant to the eye than a wide cotton field when it is in the bloom. It presents an appearance of purity, like an immaculate expanse of light, new-fallen snow. Sometimes the slave picks down one side of a row and back upon the other, but more usually, there is one on either side, gathering all that has blossomed, leaving the unopened bowls for a succeeding picking. When the sack is filled, it is emptied into the basket and trodden down. It is necessary to be extremely careful the first time going through the field, in order not to break the branches off the stalks. The cotton will not bloom upon a broken branch. Epps never failed to inflict the severest chastisement on the unlucky servant who, either carelessly or unavoidably, was guilty in the least degree in this respect. The hands are required to be in the cotton field as soon as it is light in the morning, and with the exception of 10 or 15 minutes, which is given them at noon to swallow their allowance of cold bacon, they are not permitted to be a moment idle until it is too dark to see. And when the moon is full, they oftentimes labor till the middle of the night. They do not dare to stop even at dinner time, nor return to the quarters, however late it be, until the order to halt is given by the driver. The day's work over in the field, the baskets are toted, or in other words, carried to the gin house, where the cotton is weighed. No matter how fatigued and weary he may be, no matter how much he longs for sleep and rest, a slave never approaches the gin house with his basket of cotton, but with fear. It falls short in weight if he has not performed the full task appointed him. He knows that he must suffer, and if he has exceeded it by 10 or 20 pounds, in all probability his master will measure the next day's task accordingly. So whether he is too little or too much, his approach to the gin house is always with fear and trembling. Most frequently they have too little, and therefore it is they are not anxious to leave the field. After weighing, follow the whippings, and then the baskets are carried to the cotton house, and their contents stored away like hay, all hands being sent in to tramp it down. If the cotton is not dry, instead of taking it to the gin house at once, it is laid upon platforms 2 feet high and some 3 times as wide, covered with boards or plank, with narrow walks running between them. This done, the labor of the day is not yet ended, by any means. Each one must then attend to his respective chores. One feeds the mules, another the swine, another cuts the wood, and so forth. Besides, the packing is all done by candlelight. Finally, at a late hour, they reach the quarters, sleepy and overcome with the long day's toil. Then a fire must be kindled in the cabin, the corn ground in the small hand mill, and supper and dinner for the next day in the field prepared. All that is allowed them is corn and bacon, which is given out at the corn crib and smokehouse every Sunday morning. Each one receives, as his weekly allowance, 3½ pounds of bacon, and corn enough to make a peck of meal. That is all no tea, coffee, sugar, and with the exception of a very scanty sprinkling now and then, no salt. I can say from a 10 years' residence with Master Epps that no slave of his is ever likely to suffer from a gout, superinduced by excessive high living. Master Epps' hogs were fed on shelled corn. It was thrown out to his niggers in the ear. The former, he thought, would fatten faster by shelling, and soaking it in the water the latter, perhaps, if treated in the same manner, might grow too fat to labor. Master Epps was a shrewd calculator, and knew how to manage his own animals, drunk or sober. The corn mill stands in the yard beneath a shelter. It is like a common coffee mill, the hopper holding about 6 quarts. There was one privilege which Master Epps granted freely to every slave he had. They might grind their corn nightly, in such small quantities as their daily wants required, or they might grind the whole week's allowance at one time, on Sundays, just as they preferred. A very generous man was Master Epps. I kept my corn in a small wooden box, the meal in a gourd. And by the way, the gourd is one of the most convenient and necessary utensils on a plantation. Besides supplying the place of all kinds of crockery in a slave cabin, it is used for carrying water to the fields. Another also contains the dinner. It dispenses with the necessity of pails, dippers, basins, and such tin and wooden superfluities altogether. When the corn is ground and fire is made, the bacon is taken down from the nail on which it hangs, a slice cut off and thrown upon the coals to broil. The majority of slaves have no knife, much less a fork. They cut their bacon with the axe at the woodpile. The cornmeal is mixed with a little water, placed in the fire and baked. When it is done brown, the ashes are scraped off and being placed upon a chip, which answers for a table. The tenant of the slave hut is ready to sit down upon the ground to supper. By this time it is usually midnight. The same fear of punishment with which they approach the gin house possesses them again on lying down to get a snatch of rest. It is the fear of oversleeping in the morning. Such an offense would certainly be attended with not less than 20 lashes, with a prayer that he may be on his feet and wide awake at the first sound of the horn. He sinks to his slumbers nightly. The softest couches in the world are not to be found in the log mansion of the slave. The one whereon I reclined year after year was a plank 12 inches wide and 10 feet long. My pillow was a stick of wood. The bedding was a coarse blanket and not a rag or shred beside. Moss might be used, were it not that it directly breeds a swarm of fleas. The cabin is constructed of logs, without floor or window. The latter is altogether unnecessary, the crevices between the logs admitting sufficient light. In stormy weather the rain drives through them, rendering it comfortless and extremely disagreeable. The rude door hangs on great wooden hinges. In one end is constructed an awkward fireplace. An hour before day, light the horn is blown. Then the slaves aroused prepare their breakfast, fill a gourd with water. In another deposit their dinner of cold bacon and corn cake, and hurry to the field again. It is an offense invariably followed by a flogging, to be found at the quarters after daybreak. Then the fears and labors of another day begin, and until its close there is no such thing as rest. He fears he will be caught lagging through the day. He fears to approach the gin house with his basket load of cotton at night. He fears, when he lies down, that he will oversleep himself in the morning. Such is a true, faithful, unexaggerated picture and description of the slave's daily life during the time of cotton picking on the shores of Bayou Boeuf. In the month of January, generally, the fourth and last picking is completed. Then commences the harvesting of corn. This is considered a secondary crop and receives far less attention than the cotton. It is planted, as already mentioned, in February. Corn is grown in that region for the purpose of fattening hogs and feeding slaves. Very little, if any, being sent to market. It is the white variety, the ear of great size, and the stalk growing to the height of 8, and oftentimes 10 feet. In August the leaves are stripped off, dried in the sun, bound in small bundles, and stored away as provender for the mules and oxen. After this the slaves go through the field, turning down the ear, for the purpose of keeping the rains from penetrating to the grain. It is left in this condition until after cotton picking is over, whether earlier or later. Then the ears are separated from the stalks, and deposited in the corn crib with the husks on. Otherwise, stripped to the husks, the weevil would destroy it. The stalks are left standing in the field. The Carolina or sweet potato is also grown in that region to some extent. They are not fed, however, to hogs or cattle, and are considered but of small importance. They are preserved by placing them upon the surface of the ground, with a slight covering of earth or cornstalks. There is not a cellar on Bayou Boeuf. The ground is so low it would fill with water. Potatoes are worth from 2 to 3 bits or shillings a barrel. Corn, except when there is an unusual scarcity, can be purchased at the same rate. As soon as the cotton and corn crops are secured, the stalks are pulled up, thrown into piles and burned. The plows are started at the same time, throwing up the beds again, preparatory to another planting. The soil in the parishes of Rapides and Avoyelles, and throughout the whole country, so far as my observation extended, is of exceeding richness and fertility. It is a kind of marl of a brown or reddish color. It does not require those invigorating compost necessary to more barren lands, and on the same field the same crop is grown for many successive years. Plowing, planting, picking cotton, gathering the corn, and pulling and burning stalks occupies the whole of the 4 seasons of the year. Drawing and cutting wood, pressing cotton, fattening and killing hogs are but incidental labors. In the month of September or October, the hogs are run out of the swamps by dogs and confined in pens. On a cold morning, generally about New Year's Day, they are slaughtered. Each carcass is cut into 6 parts and piled one above the other in salt upon large tables in the smokehouse. In this condition it remains a fortnight, when it is hung up and a fire built, and continued more than half the time during the remainder of the year. This thorough smoking is necessary to prevent the bacon from becoming infested with worms. In so warm a climate it is difficult to preserve it, and very many times myself and my companions have received our weekly allowance of 3.5 pounds when it was full of these disgusting vermin. Although the swamps are overrun with cattle, they are never made the source of profit to any considerable extent. The planter cuts his mark upon the ear or brands his initials upon the side and turns them into the swamps, to roam unrestricted within their almost limitless confines. They are the Spanish breed, small and spike-horned. I have known of droves being taken from Bayou Boeuf, but it is a very rare occurrence. The value of the best cows is about $5 each. 2 quarts at one milking would be considered an unusual large quantity. They furnish little tallow, and that of a soft, inferior quality. Notwithstanding the great number of cows that throng the swamps, the planters are indebted to the North for their cheese and butter, which is purchased in the New Orleans market. Salted beef is not an article of food either in the great house or in the cabin. Master Epps was accustomed to attend shooting matches for the purpose of obtaining what fresh beef he required. These sports occurred weekly at the neighboring village of Holmesville. Fat beeves are driven thither and shot at a stipulated price being demanded for the privilege. The lucky marksman divides the flesh among his fellows, and in this manner the attending planters are supplied. The great number of tame and untamed cattle which swarm the woods and swamps of Bayou Boeuf most probably suggested that appellation to the French, inasmuch as the term translated signifies the creek or river of the wild ox. Garden products, such as cabbages, turnips, and the like, are cultivated for the use of the master and his family. They have greens and vegetables at all times and seasons of the year. The grass withereth and the flower fadeth before the desolating winds of autumn in the chill northern latitudes. But perpetual verdure overspreads the hot lowlands, and flowers bloom in the heart of winter, in the region of Bayou Boeuf. There are no meadows appropriated to the cultivation of the grasses. The leaves of the corn supply a sufficiency of food for the laboring cattle, while the rest provide for themselves all the year in the ever-growing pasture. There are many other peculiarities of climate, habit, custom, and of the manner of living and laboring at the South, but the foregoing, it is supposed, will give the reader an insight and general idea of life on a cotton plantation in Louisiana, the mode of cultivating cane, and the process of sugar manufacturing will be mentioned in another place. Chapter 12 is where the nightmare becomes permanent. Solomon Northup has been traded again But this time, he is not bought with hesitation or handled with caution. He is claimed by Edward Epps, a man whose name will carve itself into Solomon's memory like a hot iron on skin. There is no pretense here, no scripture, no civility, only power and pain. Epps does not wear the mask Ford wore. He does not soothe or explain or justify. He demands. He consumes. A drinker, a brute, a man who believes himself ordained by heaven to wield the whip and the word. Like twin swords, he doesn't see Solomon as human. He doesn't care about his past. To Epps, he is just muscle that bleeds on command. This chapter strips away all illusions. There is no kind master here. There is no space for cleverness or reason, only cotton quotas and cruelty. Epps is a reflection of slavery in its most honest form, a system where violence is not accidental. It is foundational. He believes he owns these people, body, mind, and soul, and with every lash, every drunken shout, he seeks to prove it. Solomon steps onto the Epps plantation, and it is like entering another world. But this is not hell made of fire. This is hell made of dust, sweat, and iron discipline. The fields stretch wide, but freedom is further than ever. There is no fence, but no one runs. Why? Because fear holds tighter than chains. Here, pain is routine. Hope is a weakness. And survival is not about living. It's about vanishing. Edward Epps embodies a terrifying truth. Many slaveholders took pride in brutality. There was no shame in beating, no guilt in overwork, only the expectation of obedience and the constant threat of the lash. Solomon now picks cotton, a job defined by backbreaking pace, by sunburned skin and raw fingers, by the constant dread of not filling your sack. To fall behind is to bleed. To stop is to suffer. To speak is to disappear. Chapter 12 begins Solomon's long descent into silence. He learns when not to speak. He learns when to hide his thoughts. He learns how to survive Epps by pretending he isn't there. He has become a ghost in his own life, not because he has given up, but because every word, every glance could cost him everything. This isn't submission. It's strategy. It's survival beneath a tyrant who enjoys the breaking. In chapter 12, Solomon enters a new kind of captivity, one without masks, without mercy. Epps does not offer false hope. He offers pain and demands quiet endurance in return. This is not the end of Solomon's story, but it is the start of his greatest suffering. And through it all, he holds one truth in the marrow of his bones. He is still Solomon Northup, and one day he will be free again. But for now, the whip is real, the cotton is heavy, and the days are long. Chapter 13. On my arrival at Master Epps, in obedience to his order, the first business upon which I entered was the making of an axe helve. The handles in use, they're simply a round, straight stick. I made a crooked one, shaped like those to which I had been accustomed at the North. When finished and presented to Epps, he looked at it with astonishment, unable to determine exactly what it was. He had never before seen such a handle, and when I explained its conveniences, he was forcibly struck with the novelty of the idea. He kept it in the house a long time, and when his friends called, was wont to exhibit it as a curiosity. It was now the season of hoeing. I was first sent into the cornfield, and afterwards set to scraping cotton. In this employment, I remained until hoeing time was nearly past, when I began to experience the symptoms of approaching illness. I was attacked with chills, which were succeeded by a burning fever. I became weak and emaciated, and frequently so dizzy that it caused me to reel and stagger like a drunken man. Nevertheless, I was compelled to keep up my row. When in health, I found little difficulty in keeping pace with my fellow laborers. But now it seemed to be an utter impossibility. Often I fell behind, when the driver's lash was sure to greet my back, infusing into my sick and drooping body a little temporary energy. I continued to decline until at length the whip became entirely ineffectual. The sharpest sting of the rawhide could not arouse me. Finally, in September, when the busy season of cotton picking was at hand, I was unable to leave my cabin. Up to this time, I had received no medicine, nor any attention from my master or mistress. The old cook visited me occasionally, preparing me corn coffee, and sometimes boiling a bit of bacon, when I had grown too feeble to accomplish it myself. When it was said that I would die, Master Epps, unwilling to bear the loss, which the death of an animal worth $1,000 would bring upon him, concluded to incur the expense of sending to Holmesville for Dr. Wines. He announced to Epps that it was the effect of a climate, and there was a probability of his losing me. He directed me to eat no meat, and to partake of no more food than was absolutely necessary to sustain life. Several weeks elapsed, during which time, under the scanty diet to which I was subjected, I had partially recovered. One morning, long before I was in a proper condition to labor, Epps appeared at the cabin door, and, presenting me a sack, ordered me to the cotton field. At this time, I had had no experience whatever in cotton picking. It was an awkward business indeed. While others used both hands, snatching the cotton and depositing it in the mouth of the sack, with a precision and dexterity that was incomprehensible to me, I had to seize the bowl with one hand and deliberately draw out the white, gushing blossom with the other. Depositing the cotton in the sack, moreover, was a difficulty that demanded the exercise of both hands and eyes. I was compelled to pick it from the ground where it would fall, nearly as often as from the stalk where it had grown. I made havoc also with the branches, loaded with the yet unbroken bowls, the long, cumbersome sack swinging from side to side in a manner not allowable in the cotton field. After a most laborious day, I arrived at the gin house with my load. When the scale determined its weight to be only 95 pounds, not half the quantity required of the poorest picker, Epps threatened the severest flogging, but in consideration of my being a raw hand, concluded to pardon me on that occasion. The following day, and many days succeeding, I returned at night with no better success. I was evidently not designed for that kind of labor. I had not the gift, the dexterous fingers, and quick motion of Patsy, who could fly along one side of a row of cotton, stripping it of its undefiled and fleecy whiteness miraculously fast. Practice and whipping were alike unavailing, and Epps, satisfied of it at last, swore I was a disgrace, that I was not fit to associate with a cotton-picking nigger, that I could not pick enough in a day to pay the trouble of weighing it, and that I should go into the cotton field no more. I was now employed in cutting and hauling wood, drawing cotton from the field to the gin house, and performed whatever other service was required. Suffice to say, I was never permitted to be idle. It was rarely that a day passed by without one or more whippings. This occurred at the time the cotton was weighed. The delinquent, whose weight had fallen short, was taken out, stripped, made to lie upon the ground, face downwards, when he received a punishment proportioned to his offense. It is the literal unvarnished truth that the crack of a lash and the shrieking of the slaves can be heard from dark till bedtime on Epps' plantation, any day almost during the entire period of the cotton-picking season. The number of lashes is graduated according to the nature of the case. 25 are deemed a mere brush inflicted, for instance, when a dry leaf or piece of bole is found in the cotton, or when a branch is broken in the field. 50 is the ordinary penalty following all delinquencies of the next higher grade. 100 is called severe. It is the punishment inflicted for the serious offense of standing idle in the field. From 150 to 200 is bestowed upon him who quarrels with his cabin mates, and 500, well laid on besides. The mangling of the dog, perhaps, is certain to consign the poor, unpitied runaway to weeks of pain and agony. During the 2 years Epps remained on the plantation at Bayou Huffpower, he was in the habit, as often as once in a fortnight at least, of coming home intoxicated from Holmesville. The shooting matches almost invariably concluded with a debauch. At such times he was boisterous and half crazy. Often he would break the dishes, chairs, and whatever furniture he could lay his hands on. When satisfied with his amusement in the house, he would seize the whip and walk forth into the yard. Then it behooved the slaves to be watchful and exceeding wary. The first one who came within reach felt the smart of his lash. Sometimes for hours he would keep them running in all directions, dodging around the corners of the cabins. Occasionally he would come upon one unawares, and if he succeeded in inflicting a fair round blow, it was a feat that much delighted him. The younger children and the aged, who had become inactive, suffered then. In the midst of the confusion, he would slyly take his stand behind a cabin, waiting with raised whip, to dash it into the first black face that peeped cautiously around the corner. At other times he would come home in a less brutal humor. Then there must be a merrymaking. Then all must move to the measure of a tune. Then Master Epps must needs regale his melodious ears with the music of a fiddle. Then did he become buoyant, elastic, gaily tripping the light fantastic toe around the piazza and all for the house. Tibiats, at the time of my sale, had informed him I could play on the violin. He had received his information from Ford through the importunities of Mistress Epps. Her husband had been induced to purchase me one during a visit to New Orleans. Frequently, I was called into the house to play before the family, Mistress being passionately fond of music. All of us would be assembled in the large room of the great house, whenever Epps came home in one of his dancing moods. No matter how worn out and tired we were, there must be a general dance. When properly stationed on the floor, I would strike up a tune. "Dance, you niggers, dance," Epps would shout. Then there must be no halting or delay, no slow or languid movements. All must be brisk and lively and alert. Up and down, heel and toe, and away we go, was the order of the hour. Epps' portly form mingled with those of his dusky slaves, moving rapidly through all the mazes of the dance. Usually his whip was in his hand, ready to fall about the ears of the presumptuous thrall, who dared to rest a moment, or even stop to catch his breath. When he was himself exhausted, there would be a brief cessation, but it would be very brief. With a slash and crack and flourish of the whip, he would shout again, "Dance, niggers, dance," and away they would go once more pell-mell, while I, spurred by an occasional sharp touch of the lash, sat in a corner, extracting from my violin a marvelous quick-stepping tune. The mistress often upbraided him, declaring she would return to her father's house at Cheneyville. Nevertheless, there were times she could not restrain a burst of laughter on witnessing his uproarious pranks. Frequently, we were thus detained until almost morning, bent with excessive toil, actually suffering for a little refreshing rest, and feeling rather as if we could cast ourselves upon the earth and weep. Many a night in the house of Edwin Epps have his unhappy slaves been made to dance and laugh. Notwithstanding these deprivations, in order to gratify the whim of an unreasonable master, we had to be in the field as soon as it was light, and during the day perform the ordinary and accustomed task. Such deprivations could not be urged at the scales in extenuation of any lack of weight, or in the cornfield for not hoeing with the usual rapidity. The whippings were just as severe as if we had gone forth in the morning, strengthened and invigorated by a night's repose. Indeed, after such frantic revels, he was always more sour and savage than before, punishing for slighter causes, and using the whip with increased and more vindictive energy. 10 years I toiled for that man without reward. 10 years of my incessant labor has contributed to increase the bulk of his possessions. 10 years I was compelled to address him with downcast eyes and uncovered head in the attitude and language of a slave. I am indebted to him for nothing save undeserved abuse and stripes, beyond the reach of his inhuman thong, and standing on the soil of the free state where I was born, thanks be to heaven, I can raise my head once more among men. I can speak of the wrongs I have suffered, and of those who inflicted them, with upraised eyes. but I have no desire to speak of him or any other one otherwise than truthfully. Yet to speak truthfully of Edwin Epps would be to say he is a man in whose heart the quality of kindness or of justice is not found. A rough, rude energy, united with an uncultivated mind and an avaricious spirit, are his prominent characteristics. He is known as a nigger breaker, distinguished for his faculty of subduing the spirit of the slave, and priding himself upon his reputation in this respect, as a jockey boasts of his skill in managing a refractory horse. He looked upon a colored man, not as a human being, responsible to his creator for the small talent entrusted to him, but as a chattel personal, as mere live property, no better, except in value, than his mule or dog. When the evidence clear and indisputable was laid before him that I was a free man, and as much entitled to my liberty as he went on the day I left, he was informed that I had a wife and children, as dear to me as his own babes to him. He only raved and swore, denouncing the law that tore me from him, and declaring he would find out the man who had forwarded the letter that disclosed the place of my captivity, if there was any virtue or power in money, and would take his life. He thought of nothing but his loss, and cursed me for having been born free. He could have stood unmoved and seen the tongues of his poor slaves torn out by the roots. He could have seen them burned to ashes over a slow fire, or gnawed to death by dogs, if it only brought him profit. Such a hard, cruel, unjust man as Edwin Epps. There was but one greater savage on Bayou Boeuf than he. Jim Burns' plantation was cultivated, as already mentioned, exclusively by women. That barbarian kept their backs so sore and raw that they could not perform the customary labor demanded daily of the slave. He boasted of his cruelty, and through all the country round was accounted a more thoroughgoing, energetic man than even Epps. A brute himself, Jim Burns had not a particle of mercy for his subject brutes, and like a fool, whipped and scourged away the very strength upon which depended his amount of gain. Epps remained on Huff Power 2 years, when having accumulated a considerable sum of money, he expended it in the purchase of the plantation on the east bank of Bayou Boeuf, where he still continues to reside. He took possession of it in 1845, after the holidays were past. He carried thither with him 9 slaves, all of whom, except myself and Susan, who has since died, remain there yet. He made no addition to this force, and for 8 years the following were my companions in his quarters, viz., Abram, Wiley, Phoebe, Bob, Henry, Edward, and Patsy. All these, except Edward, born since, were purchased out of a drove by Epps during the time he was overseer for Archie B. Williams, whose plantation is situated on the shore of Red River, not far from Alexandria. Abram was tall, standing a full head above any common man. He is 60 years of age and was born in Tennessee. 20 years ago, he was purchased by a trader, carried into South Carolina, and sold to James Buford of Williamsburg County in that state. In his youth, he was renowned for his great strength, but age and unremitting toil have somewhat shattered his powerful frame and enfeebled his mental faculties. Wiley is 48. He was born on the estate of William Tassel, and for many years took charge of that gentleman's ferry over the Big Black River in South Carolina. Phoebe was a slave of Buford, Tassel's neighbor, and having married Wiley, he bought the latter at her instigation. Buford was a kind master, sheriff of the county, and in those days a man of wealth. Bob and Henry are Phoebe's children by a former husband, their father having been abandoned to give place to Wiley. That seductive youth had insinuated himself into Phoebe's affections, and therefore the faithless spouse had gently kicked her first husband out of her cabin door. Edward had been born to them on Bayou Huff Power. Patsy is 23, also from Buford's plantation. She is in no wise connected with the others, but glories in the fact that she is the offspring of a Guinea nigger, brought over to Cuba in a slave ship, and in the course of trade transferred to Buford, who was her mother's owner. This, as I learned from them, is a genealogical account of my master's slaves. For years they had been together. Often they recalled the memories of other days and sighed to retrace their steps to the old home in Carolina. Troubles came upon their master Buford, which brought far greater troubles upon them. He became involved in debt and, unable to bear up against his failing fortunes, was compelled to sell these and others of his slaves. In a chain gang, they had been driven from beyond the Mississippi to the plantation of Archie B. Williams. Edwin Epps, who, for a long while had been his driver and overseer, was about establishing himself in business on his own account at the time of their arrival, and accepted them in payment of his wages. Old Abram was a kind-hearted being, a sort of patriarch among us, fond of entertaining his younger brethren with grave and serious discourse. He was deeply versed in such philosophy as is taught in the cabin of a slave, but the great absorbing hobby of Uncle Abram was General Jackson, whom his young master in Tennessee had followed to the wars. He loved to wander back, in imagination, to the place where he was born, and to recount the scenes of his youth during those stirring times when the nation was in arms. He had been athletic and more keen and powerful than the generality of his race, but now his eye had become dim, and his natural force abated. Very often, indeed, while discussing the best method of baking the hoe cake or expatiating at large upon the glory of Jackson, he would forget where he left his hat, or his hoe, or his basket, and then would the old man be laughed at if Epps was absent, and whipped if he was present. So was he perplexed continually, and sighed to think that he was growing aged and going to decay. Philosophy and Jackson and forgetfulness had played the mischief with him, and it was evident that all of them combined were fast bringing down the gray hairs of Uncle Abram to the grave. Aunt Phoebe had been an excellent field hand, but latterly was put into the kitchen, where she remained, except occasionally, in a time of uncommon hurry. She was a sly old creature, and when not in the presence of her mistress or her master, was garrulous in the extreme. Wiley, on the contrary, was silent. He performed his task without murmur or complaint, seldom indulging in the luxury of speech, except to utter a wish that he was away from Epps and back once more in South Carolina. Bob and Henry had reached the ages of 20 and 23, and were distinguished for nothing extraordinary or unusual, while Edward, a lad of 13, not yet able to maintain his row in the corn or the cotton field, was kept in the great house to wait on the little Eppses. Patsy was slim and straight. She stood erect, as the human form is capable of standing. There was an air of loftiness in her movement that neither labor nor weariness nor punishment could destroy. Truly, Patsy was a splendid animal, and were it not that bondage had enshrouded her intellect in utter and everlasting darkness, would have been chief among 10,000 of her people. She could leap the highest fences, and a fleet hound it was indeed, that could outstrip her in a race. No horse could fling her from his back. She was a skillful teamster. She turned as true a furrow as the best, and at splitting rails there were none who could excel her. When the order to halt was heard at night, she would have her mules at the crib, unharnessed, fed, and curried, before Uncle Abram had found his hat. Not, however, for all or any of these was she chiefly famous. Such lightning-like motion was in her fingers as no other fingers ever possessed, and therefore it was that in cotton-picking time, Patsy was queen of the field. She had a genial and pleasant temper, and was faithful and obedient. Naturally, she was a joyous creature, a laughing, light-hearted girl, rejoicing in the mere sense of existence. Yet Patsy wept oftener and suffered more than any of her companions. She had been literally excoriated. Her back bore the scars of 1,000 stripes, not because she was backward in her work, nor because she was of an unmindful and rebellious spirit, but because it had fallen to her lot to be the slave of a licentious master and a jealous mistress. She shrank before the lustful eye of the one, and was in danger even of her life at the hands of the other, and between the two, She was indeed accursed. In the great house, for days together, there were high and angry words, poutings, and estrangement, whereof she was the innocent cause. Nothing delighted the mistress so much as to see her suffer, and more than once, when Epps had refused to sell her, has she tempted me with bribes to put her secretly to death, and bury her body in some lonely place in the margin of the swamp. Gladly would Patsy have appeased this unforgiving spirit, if it had been in her power, but not like Joseph. Dared she escape from Master Epps, leaving her garment in his hand. Patsy walked under a cloud. If she uttered a word in opposition to her master's will, the lash was resorted to at once to bring her to subjection. If she was not watchful when about her cabin, or when walking in the yard, a billet of wood, or a broken bottle perhaps, hurled from her mistress' hand, would smite her unexpectedly in the face. The enslaved victim of lust and hate, Patsy had no comfort of her life. These were my companions and fellow slaves, with whom I was accustomed to be driven to the field, and with whom it has been my lot to dwell for 10 years in the log cabins of Edwin Epps. They, if living, are yet toiling on the banks of Bayou Boeuf, never destined to breathe, as I now do, the blessed air of liberty, nor to shake off the heavy shackles that enthrall them, until they shall lie down forever in the dust. Chapter 13 is not filled with grand events. There is no escape attempt, no courtroom, no confrontation. But that is precisely why it's terrifying, because this chapter is about what becomes normal in a world built on suffering. Solomon Northup, plaid in body, but still Solomon in soul, has now settled into the long, brutal rhythm of cotton life under Edward Epps. And what he witnesses is not just cruelty, it is ritualized dehumanization. The fields stretch endless under the southern sun, rows upon rows of cotton, and rows upon rows of bent backs, bleeding fingers, sunburned faces. This is not a place of punishment. This is a factory of flesh, where pain is the engine and fear is the oil that keeps it running. Epps does not whip only when provoked. He whips as part of the process, as a reminder. To be slow is to bleed. To protest is to vanish. And Solomon watches. This chapter introduces an even more terrifying aspect of slavery, the expectation of complicity. Every slave is expected to police the others, to inform, to model proper behavior. Epps uses fear like a conductor uses a baton, directing the motions of those he owns. There is no refuge. Even silence is suspicious. Even kindness becomes dangerous, because intimacy breeds rebellion, and rebellion must be extinguished before it begins. To understand this chapter fully, you must understand cotton. Cotton was not just a crop. It was the lifeblood of the Southern economy. And enslaved people were not merely laborers. They were machines of profit, expected to pick hundreds of pounds per day or suffer the lash. Quotas were not negotiable. They were commandments, and the lash was the scripture. This system was not chaotic. It was methodical, efficient, refined through generations, of cruelty masked as order. By chapter 13, Solomon has not lost himself, but he is fading. He speaks less. He watches more. He calculates. Every movement is strategy. Every silence is survival. This is not submission. It is preservation. Because Solomon knows, if he shows them his soul, they'll crush it. So he hides it. He carries it like a flicker in a hurricane and waits. In chapter 13, we see the true horror of slavery. Not the whip, not the chains, but the fact that people learned to live with them, were expected to, were broken if they didn't. This chapter does not offer hope. It offers clarity that Solomon lives in a world where pain is currency and silence is a cost of survival. But still, he breathes, and that breath, no matter how shallow, is resistance. Chapter 14. The first year of Epps' residence on the bayou, 1845, the caterpillars almost totally destroyed the cotton crop throughout that region. There was little to be done, so that the slaves were necessarily idle half the time. However, There came a rumor to Bayou Boeuf that wages were high, and laborers in great demand on the sugar plantations in St. Mary's Parish. This parish is situated on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, about 140 miles from Avoyelles. The Rio Techa, a considerable stream, flows through St. Mary's to the Gulf. It was determined by the planters on the receipt of this intelligence to make up a drove of slaves to be sent down to Tuckapaw and St. Mary's, for the purpose of hiring them out in the cane fields. Accordingly, in the month of September, there were 147 collected at Holmesville, Abram, Bob, and myself among the number. Of these, about one-half were women. Epps, Alonson Pierce, Henry Toller, and Addison Roberts, with the white men, selected to accompany and take charge of the drove. They had a 2-horse carriage and 2 saddle horses for their use. A large wagon, drawn by 4 horses, and driven by John, a boy belonging to Mr. Roberts, carried the blankets and provisions. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, having been fed, preparations were made to depart. The duty assigned me was to take charge of the blankets and provisions, and see that none were lost by the way. The carriage proceeded in advance, the wagon following. Behind this the slaves were arranged, while the 2 horsemen brought up the rear, and in this order the procession moved out of Holmesville. That night we reached a Mr. McCrow's plantation, a distance of 10 or 15 miles, when we were ordered to halt. Large fires were built, and each one spreading his blanket on the ground, laid down upon it. The white men lodged in the great house. An hour before day we were aroused by the drivers coming among us, cracking their whips and ordering us to arise. Then the blankets were rolled up, and being severally delivered to me and deposited in the wagon, the procession set forth again. The following night it rained violently. We were all drenched, our clothes saturated with mud and water. Reaching an open shed, formerly a gin house, we found beneath it such shelter as it afforded. There was not room for all of us to lay down. There we remained huddled together through the night, continuing our march as usual in the morning. During the journey we were fed twice a day, boiling our bacon and baking our corn cake at the fires in the same manner as in our huts. We passed through Lafayetteville, Mountsville, Newtown to Centerville, where Bob and Uncle Abram were hired. Our number decreased as we advanced, nearly every sugar plantation requiring the services of one or more. On our route we passed the Grand Coteau or Prairie, a vast space of level, monotonous country, without a tree, except an occasional one which had been transplanted near some dilapidated dwelling. It was once thickly populated and under cultivation, but for some cause had been abandoned. The business of the scattered inhabitants that now dwell upon it is principally raising cattle. Immense herds were feeding upon it as we passed. In the center of the Grand Coteau one feels as if he were on the ocean, out of sight of land. As far as the eye can see in all directions, it is but a ruined and deserted waste. I was hired to Judge Turner, a distinguished man and extensive planter, whose large estate is situated on Bayou Sal, within a few miles of the Gulf. Bay on Sal is a small stream flowing into the bay of Atchafalaya. For some days I was employed at Turner's in repairing his sugar house, when a cane knife was put into my hand, and with 30 or 40 others, I was sent into the field. I found no such difficulty in learning the art of cutting cane that I had in picking cotton. It came to me naturally and intuitively, and in a short time I was able to keep up with the fastest knife. Before the cutting was over, however, Judge Turner transferred me from the field to the sugar house, to act there in the capacity of driver. From the time of the commencement of sugar making to the close, the grinding and boiling does not cease day or night. The whip was given me with directions to use upon anyone who was caught standing idle. If I failed to obey them to the letter, there was another one for my own back. In addition to this, my duty was to call on and off the different gangs at the proper time. I had no regular periods of rest, and could never snatch but a few moments of sleep at a time. It is a custom in Louisiana, as I presume it is in other slave states, to allow the slave to retain whatever compensation he may obtain for services performed on Sundays. In this way only are they able to provide themselves with any luxury or convenience whatever. When a slave purchased or kidnapped in the North is transported to a cabin on Bayou Boeuf, he is furnished with neither knife, nor fork, nor dish, nor kettle, nor any other thing in the shape of crockery, or furniture of any nature or description. He is furnished with a blanket before he reaches there, and wrapping that around him, he can either stand up or lie down upon the ground, or on a board, if his master has no use for it. He is at liberty to find a gourd in which to keep his meal, or he can eat his corn from a cob, just as he pleases. To ask the master for a knife or skillet or any small convenience of the kind would be answered with a kick or laughed at as a joke. Whatever necessary article of this nature is found in a cabin has been purchased with Sunday money. However injurious to the morals, it is certainly a blessing to the physical condition of the slave to be permitted to break the Sabbath. Otherwise, there would be no way to provide himself with any utensils, which seemed to be indispensable to him who was compelled to be his own cook. On cane plantations in sugar time, there is no distinction as to the days of the week. It is well understood that all hands must labor on the Sabbath, and it is equally well understood that those especially who are hired, as I was to Judge Turner, and others in succeeding years, shall receive remuneration for it. It is usual also, in the most hurrying time of cotton picking, to require the same extra service. From this source, slaves generally are afforded an opportunity of earning sufficient to purchase a knife, a kettle, tobacco, and so forth. The females, discarding the latter luxury, are apt to expend their little revenue in the purchase of gaudy ribbons, wherewithal to deck their hair in the merry season of the holidays. I remained in St. Mary's until the 1st of January, during which time my Sunday money amounted to $10. I met with other good fortune, for which I was indebted to my violin, my constant companion, the source of profit, and soother of my sorrows during years of servitude. There was a grand party of whites assembled at Mr. Yarney's in Centerville, a hamlet in the vicinity of Turner's plantation. I was employed to play for them, and so well pleased were the merrymakers with my performance that a contribution was taken for my benefit, which amounted to $17. With this sum in possession, I was looked upon by my fellows as a millionaire. It afforded me great pleasure to look at it, to count it over and over again, day after day. Visions of cabin furniture, of water pails, of pocket knives, new shoes and coats and hats floated through my fancy, and up through all rose the triumphant contemplation that I was the wealthiest nigger on Bayou Boeuf. Vessels run up the Rio Teche to Centerville. While there, I was bold enough one day to present myself before the captain of a steamer, and beg permission to hide myself among the freight. I was emboldened to risk the hazard of such a step from overhearing conversation, in the course of which I ascertained he was a native of the North. I did not relate to him the particulars of my history, but only expressed an ardent desire to escape from slavery to a free state. He pitied me, but said it would be impossible to avoid the vigilant custom house officers in New Orleans, and that detection would subject him to punishment and his vessel to confiscation. My earnest entreaties evidently excited his sympathies, and doubtless he would have yielded to them, could he have done so with any kind of safety. I was compelled to smother the sudden flame that lighted up my bosom with sweet hopes of liberation, and turn my steps once more towards the increasing darkness of despair. Immediately after this event the drove assembled at Centerville, and several of the owners having arrived and collected the monies due for our services, we were driven back to Bayou Boeuf. It was on our return, while passing through a small village, that I caught sight of Tibiats, seated in the door of a dirty grocery, looking somewhat seedy and out of repair. passion, and poor whiskey, I doubt not, have ere this laid him on the shelf. During our absence, I learned from Aunt Phoebe and Patsy that the latter had been getting deeper and deeper into trouble. The poor girl was truly an object of pity. Old Hogjaw, the name by which Epps was called when the slaves were by themselves, had beaten her more severely and frequently than ever. As surely as he came from Holmesville, elated with liquor, and it was often in those days he would whip her, merely to gratify the mistress, would punish her to an extent almost beyond endurance, for an offense of which he himself was the sole and irresistible cause. In his sober moments, he could not always be prevailed upon to indulge his wife's insatiable thirst for vengeance. To be rid of Patsy, to place her beyond sight or reach, by sale or death, or in any other manner, of late years, seemed to be the ruling thought and passion of my mistress. Patsy had been a favorite when a child. Even in the great house, she had been petted and admired for her uncommon sprightliness and pleasant disposition. She had been fed many a time, so Uncle Abram said even on biscuit and milk, when the madam in her younger days was wont to call her to the piazza and fondle her as she would a playful kitten. But a sad change had come over the spirit of the woman. Now only black and angry fiends ministered in the temple of her heart until she could look on Patsy, but with concentrated venom. Mistress Epps was not naturally such an evil woman, after all. She was possessed of the devil jealousy, it is true, but aside from that, there was much in her character to admire. Her father, Mr. Roberts, resided in Cheneyville, an influential and honorable man, and as much respected throughout the parish as any other citizen. She had been well educated at some institution this side the Mississippi, was beautiful, accomplished, and usually good-humored. She was kind to all of us, but Patsy frequently, in the absence of her husband, sending out to us some little dainty from her own table. In other situations, in a different society from that which exists on the shores of Bayou Boeuf, she would have been pronounced an elegant and fascinating woman. An ill wind it was that blew her into the arms of Epps. He respected and loved his wife as much as a coarse nature like his is capable of loving. But supreme selfishness always overmastered conjugal affection. He loved as well as baser natures can, but a mean heart and soul were in that man. He was ready to gratify any whim, to grant any request she made, provided it did not cost too much. Patsy was equal to any two of his slaves in the cotton field. He could not replace her with the same money she would bring. The idea of disposing of her, therefore, could not be entertained. The mistress did not regard her at all in that light. The pride of a haughty woman was aroused. The blood of the fiery Southern boiled at the sight of Patsy, and nothing less than trampling out the life of the helpless bondwoman would satisfy her. Sometimes the current of her wrath turned upon him whom she had just caused to hate. But the storm of angry words would pass over at length, and there would be a season of calm again. At such times Patsy trembled with fear and cried as if her heart would break, for she knew from painful experience that if mistress should work herself to the red-hot pitch of rage, Epps would quiet her at last with a promise that Patsy should be flogged, a promise he was sure to keep. Thus did pride and jealousy and vengeance war with avarice and brute passion in the mansion of my master, filling it with daily tumult and contention. Thus upon the head of Patsy, the simple-minded slave, in whose heart God had implanted the seeds of virtue, the force of all these domestic tempests spent itself at last. During the summer succeeding my return from St. Mary's Parish, I conceived a plan of providing myself with food, which, though simple, succeeded beyond expectation. It has been followed by many others in my condition up and down the bayou, and of such benefit has it become that I am almost persuaded to look upon myself as a benefactor. That some of the worms got into the bacon. Nothing but ravenous hunger could induce us to swallow it. The weekly allowance of meals scarcely sufficed to satisfy us. It was customary with us, as it is with all in that region where the allowance is exhausted before Saturday night, or is in such a state as to render it nauseous and disgusting, to hunt in the swamps for coon and opossum. This, however, must be done at night, after the day's work is accomplished. There are planters whose slaves, for months at a time, have no other meat than such as is obtained in this manner. No objections are made to hunting, inasmuch as it dispenses with drafts upon the smokehouse, and because every marauding coon that is killed is so much saved from the standing corn. They are hunted with dogs and clubs, slaves not being allowed the use of firearms. The flesh of the coon is palatable, but verily there is nothing in all butcherdom so delicious as a roasted possum. They are a round, rather long-bodied little animal of a whitish color, with nose like a pig and caudal extremity like a rat. They burrow among the roots and in the hollows of the gum tree, and are clumsy and slow of motion. They are deceitful and cunning creatures. On receiving the slightest tap of a stick, they will roll over on the ground and feign death. If a hunter leaves him in pursuit of another, without first taking particular pains to break his neck, the chances are, on his return, he is not to be found. The little animal has outwitted the enemy, has played possum, and is off. But after a long and hard day's work, the weary slave feels little like going to the swamp for his supper, and half the time prefers throwing himself on the cabin floor without it. It is for the interest of the master that the servant should not suffer in hell from starvation, and it is also for his interest that he should not become gross from overfeeding. In the estimation of the owner, a slave is the most serviceable when in rather a lean and lank condition, such a condition as the racehorse is in when fitted for the course. And in that condition they are generally to be found on the sugar and cotton plantations along Red River. My cabin was within a few rods of the bayou bank, and necessity being indeed the mother of invention, I resolved upon a mode of obtaining the requisite amount of food, without the trouble of resorting nightly to the woods. This was to construct a fish trap, having in my mind conceived the manner in which it could be done. The next Sunday I set about putting it into practical execution. It may be impossible for me to convey to the reader a full and correct idea of its construction, but the following will serve as a general description. A frame between 2 and 3 feet square is made, and of a greater or less height, according to the depth of water. Boards or slats are nailed on 3 sides of this frame, not so closely, however, as to prevent the water circulating freely through it. A door is fitted into the 4th side in such manner that it will slide easily up and down in the grooves cut in the 2 posts. A movable bottom is then so fitted that it can be raised to the top of the frame without difficulty. In the center of the movable bottom, an auger hole is bored, and into this one end of a handle or round stick is fastened on the underside, so loosely that it will turn. The handle ascends from the center of the movable bottom to the top of the frame, or as much higher as is desirable. Up and down this handle in a great many places are gimlet holes, through which small sticks are inserted, extending to opposite sides of the frame. So many of these small sticks are running out from the handle in all directions, that a fish of any considerable dimensions cannot pass through without hitting one of them. The frame is then placed in the water and made stationary. The trap is set by sliding or drawing up the door and kept in that position by another stick, one end of which rests in a notch on the inner side, the other end in a notch made in the handle, running up from the center of the movable bottom. The trap is baited by rolling a handful of wet meal and cotton together until it becomes hard, and depositing it in the back part of the frame. A fish swimming through the upraised door towards the bait necessarily strikes one of the small sticks turning the handle, which, displacing the stick supporting the door, the latter falls, securing the fish within the frame, taking hold of the top of the handle. The movable bottom is then drawn up to the surface of the water, and the fish taken out. There may have been other such traps in use before mine was constructed, but if there were, I had never happened to see one. Bayou buff abounds in fish of large size and excellent quality, and after this time I was very rarely in want of one for myself or for my comrades. Thus a mind was opened, a new resource was developed, hitherto unthought of by the enslaved children of Africa, who toil and hunger along the shores of that sluggish but prolific stream. About the time of which I am now writing, an event occurred in our immediate neighborhood, which made a deep impression upon me, and which shows the state of society existing there, and the manner in which affronts are oftentimes avenged. Directly opposite our quarters, on the other side of the bayou, was situated the plantation of Mr. Marshall. He belonged to a family among the most wealthy and aristocratic in the country. A gentleman from the vicinity of Natchez had been negotiating with him for the purchase of the estate. One day a messenger came in great haste to our plantation, saying that a bloody and fearful battle was going on at Marshall's, that blood had been spilled, and unless the combatants were forthwith separated, the result would be disastrous. On repairing to Marshall's house, a scene presented itself that beggars description. On the floor of one of the rooms lay the ghastly corpse of the man from Natchez, while Marshall, enraged and covered with wounds and blood, was stalking back and forth, breathing out threatenings and slaughter. A difficulty had arisen in the course of their negotiation. High words ensued. When drawing their weapons, the deadly strife began that ended so unfortunately. Marshall was never placed in confinement. A sort of trial or investigation was had at Marksville, when he was acquitted and returned to his plantation, rather more respected, as I thought, than ever, from the fact that the blood of a fellow being was on his soul. Epps interested himself in his behalf, accompanying him to Marksville, and on all occasions loudly justifying him. But his services in this respect did not afterwards deter a kinsman of this same Marshall from seeking his life also. A brawl occurred between them over a gambling table, which terminated in a deadly feud. Riding up on horseback in front of the house one day, armed with pistols and bowie knife, Marshall challenged him to come forth and make a final settlement of the quarrel, or he would brand him as a coward and shoot him like a dog the first opportunity, not through cowardice, nor from any conscientious scruples, in my opinion, but through the influence of his wife. He was restrained from accepting the challenge of his enemy. A reconciliation, however, was effected afterward, since which time they have been on terms of the closest intimacy. Such occurrences, which would bring upon the parties concerned in the merited and condign punishment in the northern states, are frequent on the bayou and pass without notice and almost without comment. Every man carries his bowie knife, and when two fall out, they set to work hacking and thrusting at each other, more like savages than civilized and enlightened beings. The existence of slavery in its most cruel form among them has a tendency to brutalize the humane and finer feelings of their nature. Daily witnesses of human suffering, listening to the agonizing screeches of the slave, beholding him writhing beneath the merciless lash, bitten and torn by dogs, dying without attention, and buried without shroud or coffin, it cannot otherwise be expected than that they should become brutified and reckless of human life. It is true there are many kind-hearted and good men in the parish of Avoyelles, such men as William Ford, who can look with pity upon the sufferings of a slave, just as there are over all the world sensitive and sympathetic spirits, who cannot look with indifference upon the sufferings of any creature which the Almighty has endowed with life. It is not the fault of the slaveholder that he is cruel, so much as it is the fault of the system under which he lives. He cannot withstand the influence of habit and associations that surround him. Taught from earliest childhood, by all that he sees and hears, that the rod is for the slave's back, he will not be apt to change his opinions in maturer years. There may be humane masters, as there certainly are inhuman ones. There may be slaves, well-clothed, well-fed, and happy, as there surely are those half-clad, half-starved, and miserable. Nevertheless, the institution that tolerates such wrong and inhumanity as I have witnessed is a cruel, unjust, and barbarous one. Men may write fictions portraying lowly life as it is, or, as it is not, may expatiate with owlish gravity upon the bliss of ignorance, discourse flippantly from armchairs of the pleasures of slave life. But let them toil with him in the field, sleep with him in the cabin, feed with him on husks. Let them behold him scourged, hunted, trampled on, and they will come back with another story in their mouths. Let them know the heart of the poor slave, learn his secret thoughts, thoughts he dare not utter in the hearing of the white man. Let them sit by him in the silent watches of the night, converse with him in trustful confidence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they will find that 99 out of every 100 are intelligent enough to understand their situation and to cherish in their bosoms the love of freedom as passionately as themselves. Chapter 14 is where pain takes on a new shape. Until now, Solomon's world has been marked by brutality born of control, the whip, the field, the unrelenting quotas. But here, we witness something more disturbing. The cruelty becomes personal, focused, obsessive, and its victim is Patsy. She enters the story like a sunbeam piercing the dark. Patsy, quick with her hands, light on her feet, unmatched in a cotton rose. But beauty, in a world ruled by broken men, is not a blessing. It is a curse. Epps fixates on her, not with love, not with admiration, but with a need to possess, to consume, to control. He desires her, but he also despises her for making him feel desire. And so, he punishes her for his own weakness. This chapter confronts the raw truth of slavery's sexual terror. Patsy is not just whipped, she is hunted. Harriet, Epps's wife, sees it too. Her jealousy poisons every interaction. But instead of blaming her husband, she lashes out at Patsy because in the twisted morality of the plantation, an enslaved woman cannot be a victim. She is always to blame for the sins committed against her. Patsy's story is not an exception. It is a pattern, repeated across countless plantations, recorded in hushed tones and suppressed diaries. Enslaved women were often preyed upon by the very men who claimed to own them. There were no laws to protect them, no sympathy, only silence. And behind every powerful plantation owner was a woman like Harriet Epps, trapped in her own misery, projecting it downward with vengeance. What haunts Solomon in this chapter is not just Patsy suffering, but his inability to stop it. He watches her cry. He watches her stand proud. He watches her endure, and he can do nothing. This is the torment of the enslaved man who still remembers justice, knowing what is right, but living in a world where right has no place. Patsy becomes a symbol, not of hope, but of what happens when hope has nowhere to grow. She is brilliant, industrious, gentle, and for that, she is broken. She is the proof that goodness offers no protection in a world built on cruelty. To Epps, she is a prize he cannot own fully. To his wife, she is a wound that cannot heal. To Solomon, she is a friend he cannot save. And to us, she is unforgettable. In chapter 14, we meet the soul of this story's sorrow. Not Solomon, but Patsy, a woman caught in the crosshairs of desire, jealousy, and violence. A spirit, too, radiant for the shadows she is forced to walk in. This chapter does not end with resolution. It ends with endurance. And as Solomon watches her disappear into the dusk, he knows this is no longer just a story. It belongs to Patsy, too, and to every voice that was stolen, buried beneath cotton and silence. Chapter 15. In consequence of my inability in cotton picking, Epps was in the habit of hiring me out on sugar plantations during the season of cane cutting and sugar making. He received for my services $1 a day, with the money supplying my place on his cotton plantation. Cutting cane was an employment that suited me, and for 3 successive years I held the lead row at Hawkins, leading a gang of from 50 to 100 hands. In a previous chapter, the mode of cultivating cotton is described. This may be the proper place to speak of the manner of cultivating cane. The ground is prepared in beds, the same as it is prepared for the reception of the cotton seed, except it is plowed deeper. Drills are made in the same manner. Planting commences in January and continues until April. It is necessary to plant a sugar field only once in 3 years. 3 crops are taken before the seed or plant is exhausted. 3 gangs are employed in the operation. 1 draws the cane from the rick or stack, cutting the top and flags from the stalk, leaving only that part which is sound and healthy. Each joint of the cane has an eye, like the eye of a potato, which sends forth a sprout when buried in the soil. Another gang lays the cane in the drill, placing 2 stalks side by side in such manner that joints will occur once in 4 or 6 inches. The third gang follows with hoes, drawing earth upon the stalks and covering them to the depth of 3 inches. In 4 weeks at the farthest, the sprouts appear above the ground, and from this time forward grow with great rapidity. A sugar field is hoed 3 times, the same as cotton, save that a greater quantity of earth is drawn to the roots. By the 1st of August, hoeing is usually over. About the middle of September, whatever is required for seed is cut and stacked in ricks, as they are termed. In October it is ready for the mill or sugar house, and then the general cutting begins. The blade of a cane knife is 15 inches long, 3 inches wide in the middle, and tapering towards a point and handle. The blade is thin, and in order to be at all serviceable must be kept very sharp. Every third hand takes the lead of 2 others, one of whom is on each side of him. The lead hand in the first place, with a blow of his knife, shears the flags from the stalk. He next cuts off the top down as far as it is green. He must be careful to sever all the green from the ripe part, inasmuch as the juice of the former sours the molasses and renders it unsaleable. Then he severs the stalk at the root and lays it directly behind him. His right and left hand companions lay their stalks, when cut in the same manner, upon his. To every 3 hands there is a cart which follows, and the stalks are thrown into it by the younger slaves, when it is drawn to the sugar house and ground. If the planter apprehends a frost, the cane is windrowed. Windrowing is the cutting the stalks at an early period and throwing them lengthwise in the water furrow in such a manner that the tops will cover the butts of the stalks. They will remain in this condition 3 weeks or a month without souring, and secure from frost. When the proper time arrives, they are taken up, trimmed, and carted to the sugar house. In the month of January, the slaves enter the field again to prepare for another crop. The ground is now strewn with the tops, and flags cut from the past year's cane. On a dry day, fire is set to this combustible refuse, which sweeps over the field, leaving it bare and clean and ready for the hoes. The earth is loosened about the roots of the old stubble, and in process of time another crop springs up from the last year's seed. It is the same the year following, but the 3rd year the seed has exhausted its strength, and the field must be plowed and planted again. The 2nd year the cane is sweeter and yields more than the 1st, and the 3rd year more than the 2nd. During the 3 seasons I labored on Hawkins' plantation, I was employed a considerable portion of the time in the sugar house. He is celebrated as the producer of the finest variety of white sugar. The following is a general description of his sugar house and the process of manufacture. The mill is an immense brick building, standing on the shore of the bayou. Running out from the building is an open shed, at least 100 feet in length and 40 or 50 feet in width. The boiler in which the steam is generated is situated outside the main building. The machinery and engine rest on a brick pier, 15 feet above the floor, within the body of the building. The machinery turns 2 great iron rollers, between 2 and 3 feet in diameter and 6 or 8 feet in length. They are elevated above the brick pier and roll in toward each other. An endless carrier, made of chain and wood, like leathern belts used in small mills, extends from the iron rollers out of the main building and through the entire length of the open shed. The carts in which the cane is brought from the field as fast as it is cut are unloaded at the sides of the shed. All along the endless carrier are ranged slave children, whose business it is to place the cane upon it. When it is conveyed through the shed into the main building, where it falls between the rollers, is crushed and drops upon another carrier that conveys it out of the main building in an opposite direction, depositing it in the top of a chimney upon a fire beneath, which consumes it. It is necessary to burn it in this manner, because otherwise it would soon fill the building, and more especially because it would soon sour and engender disease. The juice of the cane falls into a conductor underneath the iron rollers, and is carried into a reservoir. Pipes convey it from thence into 5 filters, holding several hogsheads each. These filterers are filled with bone black, a substance resembling pulverized charcoal. It is made of bones calcinated in close vessels, and is used for the purpose of decolorizing, by filtration, the cane juice before boiling. Through these 5 filterers it passes in succession, and then runs into a large reservoir underneath the ground floor, from whence it is carried up, by means of a steam pump, into a clarifier made of sheet iron, where it is heated by steam until it boils. From the first clarifier it is carried in pipes to a second and a third, and thence into close iron pans, through which tubes pass, filled with steam. While in a boiling state it flows through 3 pans in succession, and is then carried in other pipes down to the coolers on the ground floor. Coolers are wooden boxes with sieve bottoms made of the finest wire. As soon as the syrup passes into the coolers and is met by the air, it grains, and the molasses at once escapes through the sieves into a cistern below. It is then white or loaf sugar of the finest kind, clean, and as white as snow. When cool, it is taken out, packed in hogsheads, and is ready for market. The molasses is then carried from the cistern into the upper story again, and by another process converted into brown sugar. There are larger mills, and those constructed differently from the one thus imperfectly described, but none, perhaps, more celebrated than this anywhere on Bayou Boeuf. Lambert of New Orleans is a partner of Hawkins. He is a man of vast wealth, holding, as I have been told, an interest in over 40 different sugar plantations in Louisiana. The only respite from constant labor the slave has through the whole year is during the Christmas holidays. Epps allowed us 3 others allow for 5 and 6 days, according to the measure of their generosity. It is the only time to which they look forward with any interest or pleasure. They are glad when night comes, not only because it brings them a few hours' repose, but because it brings them one day nearer Christmas. It is hailed with equal delight by the old and the young. Even Uncle Abram ceases to glorify Andrew Jackson, and Patsy forgets her many sorrows amid the general hilarity of the holidays. It is the time of feasting and frolicking, and fiddling the carnival season with the children of bondage. They are the only days when they are allowed a little restricted liberty, and heartily indeed do they enjoy it. It is the custom for one planter to give a Christmas supper, inviting the slaves from neighboring plantations to join his own on the occasion. For instance, one year it is given by Epps, the next by Marshall, the next by Hawkins, and so on. Usually from 300 to 500 are assembled, coming together on foot, in carts, on horseback, on mules, riding double and triple, sometimes a boy and girl, at others a girl and 2 boys, and at others again a boy, a girl, and an old woman. Uncle Abram astride a mule, with Aunt Phoebe and Patsy behind him, trotting towards a Christmas supper, would be no uncommon sight on Bayou Boeuf. Then, too, of all days of the year, they array themselves in their best attire. The cotton coat has been washed clean, the stump of a tallow candle has been applied to the shoes, and if so fortunate as to possess a rimless or a crownless hat, it is placed jauntily on the head. They are welcomed with equal cordiality, however, if they come bareheaded and barefooted to the feast. As a general thing, the women wear handkerchiefs tied about their heads, but if chance is thrown in their way a fiery red ribbon or a cast-off bonnet of their mistress grandmother, it is sure to be worn on such occasions. Red, the deep blood red, is decidedly the favorite color among the enslaved damsels of my acquaintance. If a red ribbon does not encircle the neck, you will be certain to find all the hair of their woolly heads tied up with red strings of one sort or another. The table is spread in the open air, and loaded with varieties of meat and piles of vegetables. Bacon and cornmeal at such times are dispensed with. Sometimes the cooking is performed in the kitchen on the plantation, at others in the shade of wide branching trees. In the latter case, a ditch is dug in the ground and would laid in and burned until it is filled with glowing coals, over which chickens, ducks, turkeys, pigs, and not unfrequently the entire body of a wild ox are roasted. They are furnished also with flour, of which biscuits are made, and often with peach and other preserves, with tarts and every manner and description of pies, except the mince, that being an article of pastry, as yet unknown among them. Only the slave who has lived all the years on his scanty allowance of meal and bacon can appreciate such suppers. White people in great numbers assemble to witness the gastronomical enjoyments. They seat themselves at the rustic table of males on one side, the females on the other. The two, between whom there may have been an exchange of tenderness, invariably manage to sit opposite. For the omnipresent Cupid disdains not to hurl his arrows into the simple hearts of slaves. Unalloyed and exulting happiness lights up the dark faces of them all. The ivory teeth, contrasting with their black complexions, exhibit two long, white streaks the whole extent of the table. All round the bountiful board a multitude of eyes roll in ecstasy. Giggling and laughter and the clattering of cutlery and crockery succeed. Cuffy's elbow hunches his neighbor's side, impelled by an involuntary impulse of delight. Nellie shakes her finger at Sambo and laughs. She knows not why. And so the fun and merriment flows on. When the viands have disappeared, and the hungry maws of the children of toil are satisfied, then, next in the order of amusement, is the Christmas dance. My business on these gala days always was to play on the violin. The African race is a music-loving one proverbially, and many there were among my fellow bondsmen whose organs of tune were strikingly developed, and who could thumb the banjo with dexterity. But at the expense of appearing egotistical, I must nevertheless declare that I was considered the old bull of Bayou Boeuf. My master often received letters, sometimes from a distance of 10 miles, requesting him to send me to play at a ball or festival of the whites. He received his compensation, and usually I also returned with many picayunes jingling in my pockets the extra contributions of those to whose delight I had administered. In this manner I became more acquainted than I otherwise would, up and down the bayou. The young men and maidens of Holmesville always knew there was to be a jollification somewhere, whenever Platt Epps was seen passing through the town with his fiddle in his hand. "Where are you going now, Platt? And what is coming off tonight, Platt?" would be interrogatories issuing from every door and window, and many a time when there was no special hurry. Yielding to pressing importunities, Platt would draw his bow, and sitting astride his mule, perhaps, discourse musically to a crowd of delighted children gathered around him in the street. Alas, had it not been for my beloved violin, I scarcely can conceive how I could have endured the long years of bondage. It introduced me to great houses, relieved me of many days' labor in the field, supplied me with conveniences for my cabin with pipes and tobacco, and extra pairs of shoes, and oftentimes led me away from the presence of a hard master, to witness scenes of jollity and mirth. It was my companion, the friend of my bosom, triumphing loudly when I was joyful, and uttering its soft, melodious consolations when I was sad. Often at midnight, when sleep had fled affrighted from the cabin, and my soul was disturbed and troubled with the contemplation of my fate, it would sing me a song of peace. On holy Sabbath days, when an hour or two of leisure was allowed, it would accompany me to some quiet place on the bayou bank, and, lifting up its voice, discourse kindly and pleasantly indeed. It heralded my name round the country, made me friends, who otherwise would not have noticed me, gave me an honored seat at the yearly feasts, and secured the loudest and heartiest welcome of them all at the Christmas dance. The Christmas dance, O ye pleasure-seeking sons and daughters of idleness, who move with measured step, listless and snail-like, through the slow-winding cotyledon, if ye wish to look upon the celerity, if not the poetry of motion, upon genuine happiness, rampant and unrestrained, go down to Louisiana, and see the slaves dancing in the starlight of a Christmas night. On that particular Christmas I have now in my mind a description where I will serve as a description of the day, generally. Miss Lively and Mr. Sam, the first belonging to Stuart, the latter to Roberts, started the ball. It was well known that Sam cherished an ardent passion for Lively, as also did one of Marshall's and another of Carey's boys. For Lively was lively indeed, and a heartbreaking coquette withal. It was a victory for Sam Roberts. When rising from the repast, she gave him her hand for the first figure, in preference to either of his rivals. They were somewhat crestfallen, and, shaking their heads angrily, rather intimated they would like to pitch into Mr. Sam and hurt him badly. But not an emotion of wrath ruffled the placid bosom of Samuel, as his legs flew like drumsticks down the outside and up the middle by the side of his bewitching partner. The whole company cheered them vociferously, and excited with the applause, they continued tearing down after all the others had become exhausted and halted a moment to recover breath. But Sam's superhuman exertions overcame him finally, leaving Lively alone, yet whirling like a top. Thereupon one of Sam's rivals, Pete Marshall, dashed in, and with might and main, leaped and shuffled and threw himself into every conceivable shape, as if determined to show Miss Lively and all the world that Sam Roberts was of no account. Pete's affection, however, was greater than his discretion. Such violent exercise took the breath out of him directly, and he dropped like an empty bag. Then was the time for Harry Carey to try his hand. But Lively also soon outwinded him, amidst hurrahs and shouts, fully sustaining her well-earned reputation of being the fastest gal on the bayou. One set off, another takes his place, he or she remaining longest on the floor, receiving the most uproarious commendation. And so the dancing continues until broad daylight. It does not cease with the sound of the fiddle, but in that case they set up a music peculiar to themselves. This is called patting, accompanied with one of those unmeaning songs, composed rather for its adaptation to a certain tune or measure, than for the purpose of expressing any distinct idea. The patting is performed by striking the hands on the knees, then striking the hands together, then striking the right shoulder with one hand, the left with the other, all the while keeping time with the feet and singing perhaps this song, Harper's Creek and Roar River. The My Dear will live forber. Den will go to the Injun Nation. All I want in this creation is pretty little wife and big plantation. Chorus, up dat oak and down dat river. 2 overseers and 1 little nigger. Or if these words are not adapted to the tune called for, it may be that Old Hog-Eye is a rather solemn and startling specimen of versification, not, however, to be appreciated unless heard of the South. It runneth as follows. Who's been here since I've been gone? Pretty little gal with a Josie on. Hog-Eye, Old Hog-Eye, and Hosey too. Never seed alike since I was born. Here come a little gal with a Josie on. Hog-Eye, Old Hog-Eye, and Hosey too. Or maybe the following, perhaps equally nonsensical, but full of melody nevertheless, as it flows from the Negro's mouth. Ebo Dick and Jordan's Joe, them 2 niggers stole my yo. Chorus, hop Jim along, walk Jim along, talk Jim along, and see old Black Dan as black as tar, he damn glad he was not dar. Hop Jim along, and see. During the remaining holidays succeeding Christmas, they are provided with passes and permitted to go where they please within a limited distance, or they may remain and labor on the plantation, in which case they are paid for it. It is very rarely, however, that the latter alternative is accepted. They may be seen at these times hurrying in all directions, as happy-looking mortals as can be found on the face of the earth. They are different beings from what they are in the field, the temporary relaxation, the brief deliverance from fear, and from a lash, producing an entire metamorphosis in their appearance and demeanor. In visiting, riding, renewing old friendships, or perchance reviving some old attachment, or pursuing whatever pleasure may suggest itself, the time is occupied. Such is Southern life as it is, 3 days in the year, as I founded the other 362 being days of weariness and fear and suffering and unremitting labor. Marriage is frequently contracted during the holidays, if such an institution may be said to exist among them. The only ceremony required before entering into that holy estate is to obtain the consent of the respective owners. It is usually encouraged by the masters of female slaves. Either party can have as many husbands or wives as the owner will permit, and either is at liberty to discard the other at pleasure. The law in relation to divorce or to bigamy and so forth is not applicable to property, of course. If the wife does not belong on the same plantation with the husband, the latter is permitted to visit her on Saturday nights, if the distance is not too far. Uncle Abram's wife lived 7 miles from Epps on Bayou Huff Power. He had permission to visit her once a fortnight, but he was growing old, as has been said, and truth to say, had latterly well nigh forgotten her. Uncle Abram had no time to spare from his meditations on General Jackson connubial dalliance being well enough for the young and thoughtless, but unbecoming a grave and solemn philosopher like himself. Chapter 15 is not just a turning point. It is a shattering. Here, we do not see the hidden cruelties of slavery. We see them unmasked, naked, roaring, relentless. This chapter is about Patsy and the day she is destroyed, and Solomon, helpless, horrified, is forced to become the instrument of her pain. She only asks for soap. That's how it begins. A small request, an attempt to keep clean, to retain some sliver of dignity. But Epps, drunk, insecure, broken in his own evil, convinces himself that it was a betrayal, that she sought out another man. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is power, and Patsy must be made an example. And Solomon must whip her. This is not just a physical beating. It is a performance. Epps demands that Solomon become executioner, not because he wants efficiency, but because he wants domination. To force one slave to destroy another is to turn suffering into spectacle. It breaks both of them, Patsy in body, Solomon in soul. And when he cannot strike hard enough, Epps takes the lash himself and unleashes hell. In the antebellum South, whippings were not just punishment. They were tools of psychological warfare, especially for women like Patsy, who were both laborers and victims of the master's unchecked lust. A woman like her, outspoken, bright, beloved among peers, was often targeted more viciously. To punish her was to reassert the hierarchy of terror. Epps is not trying to discipline Patsy. He is trying to annihilate her. Each lash tears more than flesh. It sears identity. It burns memory. Patsy's back becomes a map of injustice, a testament written in blood. And Solomon, whose own body once felt the bite of the noose, now watches his hands betray him, forced to become what he abhors. In this system, even morality is twisted into a weapon. Good men must harm. Good women must suffer. And justice? It does not live here. Solomon weeps. Patsy screams. Mistress Epps watches, lips tight with hate. There is no rescue, no interruption. This is the world now. And when it's over, Patsy is not dead, but something inside her is. Solomon writes that she lays in the cabin afterward, like a corpse breathing, and perhaps that's the only freedom left her, the right to no longer feel. In chapter 15, we are shown the absolute bottom, not just of slavery, but of the human soul when twisted by power and hate. And yet, even here, Solomon observes, he remembers, he bears witness, because one day he will survive this. He will write it, he will speak it, and we will hear it, so that Patsy is never forgotten, so that this pain was not in vain, so that history remembers what it once tried to bury beneath the cotton fields. Chapter 16. With the exception of my trip to St. Mary's Parish and my absence during the cane cutting seasons, I was constantly employed on the plantation of Master Epps. He was considered but a small planter, not having a sufficient number of hands to require the services of an overseer, acting in the latter capacity himself. Not able to increase his force, it was his custom to hire during the hurry of cotton picking. On larger estates employing 50 or 100 or perhaps 200 hands, an overseer is deemed indispensable. These gentlemen ride into the field on horseback without an exception, to my knowledge, armed with pistols, bowie knife, whip, and accompanied by several dogs. They follow, equipped in this fashion, in rear of the slaves, keeping a sharp lookout upon them all. The requisite qualifications in an overseer are utter heartlessness, brutality, and cruelty. It is his business to produce large crops, and if that is accomplished, no matter what amount of suffering it may have cost. The presence of the dogs are necessary to overhaul a fugitive who may take to his heels. As is sometimes the case, when faint or sick, he is unable to maintain his row, and unable, also, to endure the whip. The pistols are reserved for any dangerous emergency, there having been instances when such weapons were necessary. Goaded into uncontrollable madness, even the slave will sometimes turn upon his oppressor. The gallows were standing at Marksville last January, upon which one was executed a year ago for killing his overseer. It occurred not many miles from Epps' plantation on Red River. The slave was given his task at splitting rails. In the course of the day, the overseer sent him on an errand, which occupied so much time that it was not possible for him to perform the task. The next day he was called to an account, but the loss of time occasioned by the errand was no excuse, and he was ordered to kneel and bare his back for the reception of the lash. They were in the woods alone, beyond the reach of sight or hearing. The boy submitted until maddened at such injustice, and insane with pain, he sprang to his feet and, seizing an axe, literally chopped the overseer in pieces. He made no attempt whatever at concealment, but hastening to his master, related the whole affair, and declared himself ready to expiate the wrong by the sacrifice of his life. He was led to the scaffold, and while the rope was around his neck, maintained an undismayed and fearless bearing, and with his last words justified the act. Besides the overseer, there are drivers under him, the number being in proportion to the number of hands in the field. The drivers are black, who, in addition to the performance of their equal share of work, are compelled to do the whipping of their several gangs. Whips hang around their necks, and if they fail to use them thoroughly, are whipped themselves. They have a few privileges, however. For example, in cane cutting, the hands are not allowed to sit down long enough to eat their dinners. Carts filled with corn cake, cooked at the kitchen, are driven into the field at noon. The cake is distributed by the drivers and must be eaten with the least possible delay. When the slave ceases to perspire, as he often does when taxed beyond his strength, he falls to the ground and becomes entirely helpless. It is then the duty of the driver to drag him into the shade of the standing cotton or cane, or of a neighboring tree, where he dashes buckets of water upon him, and uses other means of bringing out perspiration again, when he is ordered to his place and compelled to continue his labor. At Huff Power, when I first came to Epps, Tom, one of Robert's Negroes, was driver. He was a burly fellow, and severe in the extreme. After Epps' removal to Bayou Boeuf, that distinguished honor was conferred upon myself. Up to the time of my departure, I had to wear a whip about my neck in the field. If Epps was present, I dared not show any lenity, not having the Christian fortitude of a certain well-known Uncle Tom sufficiently to brave his wrath by refusing to perform the office. In that way only I escaped the immediate martyrdom he suffered, and withal saved my companions much suffering, as it proved in the end. Epps, I soon found, whether actually in the field or not, had his eyes pretty generally upon us, from the piazza, from behind some adjacent tree, or other concealed point of observation. He was perpetually on the watch. If one of us had been backward or idle through the day, we were apt to be told all about it on returning to the quarters. And as it was a matter of principle with him to reprove every offense of that kind that came within his knowledge, the offender not only was certain of receiving a castigation for his tardiness, but I likewise was punished for permitting it. If, on the other hand, he had seen me use the lash freely, the man was satisfied. Practice makes perfect, truly. And during my 8 years' experience as a driver, I learned to handle the whip with marvelous dexterity and precision, throwing the lash within a hair's breadth of the back, the ear, the nose, without, however, touching either of them. If Epps was observed at a distance, or we had reason to apprehend he was sneaking somewhere in the vicinity, I would commence plying the lash vigorously, when, according to arrangement, they would squirm and screech as if in agony, although not one of them had in fact been even grazed. Patsy would take occasion, if he made his appearance presently, to mumble in his hearing some complaints that Platt was lashing them the whole time, and Uncle Abram, with an appearance of honesty peculiar to himself, would declare roundly I had just whipped them worse than General Jackson whipped the enemy at New Orleans. If Epps was not drunk, and one of his beastly humors, this was, in general, satisfactory. If he was, some one or more of us must suffer, as a matter of course. Sometimes his violence assumed a dangerous form, placing the lives of his human stock in jeopardy. On one occasion the drunken madman thought to amuse himself by cutting my throat. He had been absent at Holmesville in attendance at a shooting match, and none of us were aware of his return. While hoeing by the side of Patsy, she exclaimed, in a low voice suddenly, "Platt, do you see old Hogjaw beckoning me to come to him?" Glancing sideways, I discovered him in the edge of the field, motioning and grimacing, as was his habit when half intoxicated. Aware of his lewd intentions, Patsy began to cry. I whispered her not to look up and to continue at her work as if she had not observed him. Suspecting the truth of the matter, however, he soon staggered up to me in a great rage. "What did you say to Pats?" he demanded with an oath. I made him some evasive answer, which only had the effect of increasing his violence. "How long have you owned this plantation, say you, nigger?" he inquired, with a malicious sneer, at the same time taking hold of my shirt collar with one hand and thrusting the other into his pocket. "Now I'll cut your black throat. That's what I'll do," drawing his knife from his pocket as he said it. But with one hand he was unable to open it, until finally seizing the blade in his teeth, I saw he was about to succeed, and felt the necessity of escaping from him. For in his present reckless state, it was evident he was not joking, by any means. My shirt was open in front, and as I turned round quickly and sprang from him, while he still retained his gripe, it was stripped entirely from my back. There was no difficulty now in eluding him. He would chase me until out of breath, then stop until it was recovered, swear, and renew the chase again. Now he would command me to come to him, now endeavor to coax me, but I was careful to keep at a respectful distance. In this manner we made the circuit of the field several times, he making desperate plunges, and I always dodging them, more amused than frightened, well knowing that when his sober senses returned, he would laugh at his own drunken folly. At length I observed the mistress standing by the yard fence, watching our half-serious, half-comical maneuvers. Shooting past him, I ran directly to her. Epps, on discovering her, did not follow. He remained about the field an hour or more, during which time I stood by the mistress, having related the particulars of what had taken place. Now she was aroused again, denouncing her husband and Patsy about equally. Finally, Epps came towards the house, by this time nearly sober, walking demurely, with his hands behind his back, and attempting to look as innocent as a child. As he approached, nevertheless, Mistress Epps began to berate him roundly, heaping upon him many rather disrespectful epithets, and demanding for what reason he had attempted to cut my throat. Epps made wondrous strange of it all, and to my surprise, swore by all the saints in the calendar he had not spoken to me that day. Platt, you lying nigger, have I?" was his brazen appeal to me. It is not safe to contradict a master, even by the assertion of a truth. So I was silent, and when he entered the house, I returned to the field, and the affair was never after alluded to. Shortly after this time, a circumstance occurred that came nigh divulging the secret of my real name and history, which I had so long and carefully concealed, and upon which I was convinced depended my final escape. Soon after he purchased me, Epps asked me if I could write and read, and on being informed that I had received some instruction in those branches of education, he assured me, with emphasis, if he ever caught me with a book, or with pen and ink, he would give me 100 lashes. He said he wanted me to understand that he bought niggers to work and not to educate. He never inquired a word of my past life, or from whence I came. The mistress, however, cross-examined me frequently about Washington, which she supposed was my native city, and more than once remarked that I did not talk nor act like the other niggers, and she was sure I had seen more of the world than I admitted. My great object always was to invent means of getting a letter secretly into the post office, directed to some of my friends or family at the North. The difficulty of such an achievement cannot be comprehended by one unacquainted with the severe restrictions imposed upon me. In the first place, I was deprived of pen, ink, and paper. In the second place, a slave cannot leave his plantation without a pass, nor will a postmaster mail a letter for one without written instructions from his owner. I was in slavery 9 years and always watchful and on the alert before I met with the good fortune of obtaining a sheet of paper. While Epps was in New Orleans one winter disposing of his cotton, the mistress sent me to Holmesville with an order for several articles, and among the rest a quantity of foolscap. I appropriated a sheet, concealing it in the cabin, under the board on which I slept. After various experiments, I succeeded in making ink by boiling white maple bark, and with a feather plucked from the wing of a duck, manufactured a pen. When all were asleep in the cabin, by the light of the coals, lying upon my plank couch, I managed to complete a somewhat lengthy epistle. It was directed to an old acquaintance at Sandy Hill, stating my condition and urging him to take measures to restore me to liberty. This letter I kept a long time, contriving measures by which it could be safely deposited in the post office. At length a low fellow, by the name of Armsby, hitherto a stranger, came into the neighborhood, seeking a situation as overseer. He applied to Epps and was about the plantation for several days. He next went over to Shaw's nearby and remained with him several weeks. Shaw was generally surrounded by such worthless characters, being himself noted as a gambler and unprincipled man. He had made a wife of his slave Charlotte, and a brood of young mulattoes were growing up in his house. Armsby became so much reduced at last that he was compelled to labor with the slaves. A white man working in the field is a rare and unusual spectacle on Bayou Boeuf. I improved every opportunity of cultivating his acquaintance privately, desiring to obtain his confidence so far as to be willing to entrust the letter to his keeping. He visited Marksville repeatedly, he informed me, a town some 20 miles distant, and there I proposed to myself the letter should be mailed. Carefully deliberating on the most proper manner of approaching him on the subject, I concluded finally to ask him simply if he would deposit a letter for me in the Marksville post office the next time he visited that place, without disclosing to him that the letter was written or any of the particulars it contained. For I had fears that he might betray me, and knew that some inducement must be held out to him of a pecuniary nature, before it would be safe to confide in him. As late as 1 o'clock one night, I stole noiselessly from my cabin, and crossing the field to Shaw's, found him sleeping on the piazza. I had but a few picayunes, the proceeds of my fiddling performances, but all I had in the world I promised him if he would do me the favor required. I begged him not to expose me if he could not grant the request. He assured me upon his honor he would deposit it in the Marksville post office, and that he would keep it an inviolable secret forever. Though the letter was in my pocket at the time, I dared not then deliver it to him, but stating I would have it written in a day or two, bade him good night, and returned to my cabin. It was impossible for me to expel the suspicions I entertained, and all night I lay awake, revolving in my mind the safest course to pursue. I was willing to risk a great deal to accomplish my purpose, but should the letter by any means fall into the hands of Epps, it would be a death blow to my aspirations. I was perplexed in the extreme. My suspicions were well-founded, as the sequel demonstrated. The next day but one, while scraping cotton in the field, Epps seated himself on the line fence between Shaw's plantation and his own, in such a position as to overlook the scene of our labors. Presently Armsby made his appearance, and, mounting the fence, took a seat beside him. They remained 2 or 3 hours, all of which time I was in an agony of apprehension. That night, while broiling my bacon, Epps entered the cabin with his rawhide in his hand. "Well, boy," said he, "I understand I've got a larned nigger that writes letters and tries to get white fellows to mail 'em. Wonder if you know who he is?" My worst fears were realized, and although it may not be considered entirely creditable, even under the circumstances, yet a resort to duplicity and downright falsehood was the only refuge that presented itself. "Don't know nothing about it, Master Epps," I answered him, assuming an air of ignorance and surprise. "Don't know nothing at all about it, sir." "Want you over to Shaw's night before last?" he inquired. "No, master," was the reply. "Haven't you asked that fellow Armsby to mail a letter for you at Marksville?" "Why, Lord, master, I never spoke 3 words to him in all my life." "I don't know what you mean." "Well," he continued, "Armsby told me today the devil was among my niggers, that I had one that needed close watching or he would run away. And when I asked him why, he said you come over to Shaw's and waked him up in the night and wanted him to carry a letter to Marksville. What have you got to say to that?" "Ha! All I've got to say, master," I replied, "is there is no truth in it. How could I write a letter without any ink or paper? There's nobody I want to write to, 'cause I hain't got no friends living as I know of. That Armsby is a lying, drunken fellow, they say, and nobody believes him anyway. You know, I always tell the truth, and that I never go off the plantation without a pass. Now, master, I can see what that Armsby is after plain enough. Didn't he want you to hire him for an overseer?" "Yes, he wanted me to hire him," answered Epps. "That's it," said I. "He wants to make you believe we're all going to run away, and then he thinks you'll hire an overseer to watch us. He just made that story out of whole cloth, 'cause he wants to get a situation. It's all a lie, master. You may depend on it." Epps mused a while, evidently impressed with the plausibility of my theory, and exclaimed, "I'm D-Plat, if I don't believe you tell the truth. He must take me for a soft, to think he can come it over me with them kind of yarns, must he? Maybe he thinks he can fool me. Maybe he thinks I don't know nothing, can't take care of my own niggers. Soft soap, old Epps. D. and Armsby. Set the dogs on him, Platt." And with many other comments descriptive of Armsby's general character, and his capability of taking care of his own business, and attending to his own niggers, Master Epps left the cabin. As soon as he was gone, I threw the letter in the fire, and with a desponding and despairing heart, beheld the epistle which had cost me so much anxiety and thought, and which I fondly hoped would have been my forerunner to the land of freedom, writhe and shrivel on its bed of coals, and dissolve into smoke and ashes. Armsby, the treacherous wretch, was driven from Shaw's plantation not long subsequently, much to my relief, for I feared he might renew his conversation, and perhaps induce Epps to credit him. I knew not now whither to look for deliverance. Hope sprang up in my heart only to be crushed and blighted. The summer of my life was passing away. I felt I was growing prematurely old, that a few years more in toil and grief, and the poisonous miasmas of the swamps would accomplish their work upon me, would consign me to the grave's embrace, to molder and be forgotten, repelled, betrayed, cut off from a hope of succor. I could only prostrate myself upon the earth and groan in unutterable anguish. The hope of rescue was the only light that cast a ray of comfort on my heart, that was now flickering faint and low. Another breath of disappointment would extinguish it altogether, leaving me to grope in midnight darkness to the end of life. Chapter 16 is quieter. No lashes fall, no cries split the air. But do not mistake this silence for peace. It is the silence that follows devastation, the silence where memory sharpens like a blade. Solomon Northup is still on Epps's plantation, still enslaved, still watched, but inside something has changed. He is done begging. He is done pleading for justice from men who cannot hear it. Now he begins to plan. Solomon can no longer protect others. He couldn't save Patsy. He couldn't defy Epps. So now he turns inward, back to memory. He remembers home, music, his wife, his children, and with each recollection, he reforges his name, his truth, his purpose. In a world that calls him Platt, he repeats silently, I am Solomon Northup. I am Solomon Northup. I am Solomon Northup. This is not a mantra of hope, but one of defiance. This chapter lives in the margins, between picking and resting, between obedience and watchfulness. There's no dramatic outburst, just a man enduring, but no longer passively. Solomon observes. He studies Epps. He notes who visits, who writes, who leaves. He begins to think like a free man again, even while wearing the chains, because freedom, for now, lives only in the mind. But minds cannot be whipped. Throughout this chapter, we hear not of violence, but of calculation. Solomon looks for a way to send a letter, to make contact with the world he was stolen from. And that search, that act of seeking communication, is itself a revolution, because in a system that thrives on silence, to speak, to write, is to reclaim agency. The lash silences, the letter shouts, and Solomon is ready to shout again. For an enslaved person to write a letter in the 1840s was not just forbidden, it was life-threatening. Literacy was criminalized. Mail was monitored. Any attempt to reach the North could mean mutilation or death. But Solomon has nothing left to lose. He has survived the noose. He has survived Epps. He has survived the unthinkable. And now he will begin to fight back. Not with fists, not with flames, but with words. This chapter is not loud. It is deliberate. The way a seed begins in soil, before breaking open the earth. The way a song begins with silence. Solomon knows now that no one is coming. No justice will fall from the sky. If he is to escape, he must summon his own salvation. This is not hope. It's strategy. This is not the end. It is the first flicker of uprising. In chapter 16, Solomon learns what every survivor of cruelty must. That memory is resistance. That planning is rebellion. That one's true name, spoken in the mind, is the first cry of freedom. And though his body remains bound, Solomon's spirit has already begun to move, to reach, to fight. The first stroke has been made. The ink is not yet dry, but the letter is coming.
Through beatings, toil, and the endless southern sun, Solomon Northup endures, not because he accepts it, but because he refuses to forget who he is. This was part 3 of 12 Years a Slave, chapters 11 to 16. I'm Rob, and this is Audible Archives. If this story continues to stir something in you, like, comment, and subscribe. We're not done yet. The road to freedom is still ahead.
And so, the tale draws to a close, but the echoes remain here in the Audible Archives. And until our next journey through shadow and story, keep listening, keep wondering, because every ending hides another beginning. Audible Archives, where stories never sleep.